Africa. A recent report by UN experts found that these two pillars, quote, can significantly and middle income countries, so that's us, and could have a discriminatory impact on the grounds of gender, ethnicity, and race. And moving on to not just through the tax rates, but also through tax incentives, and that has also been talked about many times throughout this conference. I'm not going to go into details. I'm just going to give a number. In Tunisia, tax incentives, so the cost, the revenues that we are not collecting because of these tax incentives is around 12% of the annual budget of the government. To put that into perspective, it's more than 1.5 times the entirety of the budget of the health ministry. Third, I want to talk about the low taxation on capital gains. So capital gains are mostly targeting high income and high wealth individuals because those are the people who are able to buy and sell assets. And we find that this income and this wealth is not taxed throughout the continent. To take the example of Egypt, for example, we find that income coming from interest is exempt from taxation. Capital gains on movable property is exempt from taxation. Capital gains from immovable property also exempt from taxation. And the tax on dividend income is only at 5%. On the other hand, we find wealth taxes to be nearly absent from the continent. And if they are there, they are very low rates, and the scope of it, the tax base, is very limited, and the administration simply does not have the capacity to track the information of taxpayers. So if we're not taxing corporations, if we're not taxing high income individuals, if we're not taxing wealth, then who are we taxing? And now I want to talk about who and what gets overtaxed. And here we find that most of the revenue of the tax revenue of the continent comes from indirect taxation. And here we're essentially focusing on consumption. We're talking about sales taxes, value-added taxes, etc. And these regressive proportional taxes eat away at the income and savings of low-income people, women included, and other vulnerable communities. But I want to also talk about not only how they effectively entrench the poverty of women and other vulnerable groups, but they also increase the unpaid care work of women. So women are often tasked with managing household consumption. So they have to buy things like food, water, cleaning products, etc., with a very limited budget. And when the prices of these products increase, women have to take on extra time to either find cheaper replacements for these products or make their own replacements. And here, to give a few examples, they might start making their own cleaning products that not only take time, but also have very serious effects on health. They might have to take time to make their own bread or some other ingredients that they used to buy prepaid. So these things add up to increase the time and effort that women have to invest in their unpaid care work, an unpaid care work that is already incredibly unequal. As such, taxation limits what the government can afford to spend. And here we're talking about lower access to affordable public services such as childcare, elder care, care for people with disabilities, education, healthcare, and all of these things in the absence of public institution, of accessible and affordable public institution. It's the women who have to play the part of shock absorbers and have to take on this extra effort, of course, unpaid. So these are only some of the aspects on which the international and the national tax systems not only entrench the poverty and the vulnerability of women, but also increase their share of unpaid care work. And now I want to talk about how we can make sure that the UN Tax Convention, as opposed to other structures such as the OECD frameworks, can actually work to be a revolutionary tool to dismantle patriarchal and capital tax structures and be more equitable and a more just solution. And here we need to make sure that the convention has a broad mandate. So there has been some discussion in the negotiation on making the UN convention only about capacity building. And that is incredibly dangerous because we need structures and conventions at a democratic institutions such as the UN and not exclusionary institutions such as the IMF or the OECD to have discussions around wealth taxation, around digital taxation, to have things around international corporate taxation, around IFFs, etc. So there's a fight happening, and we need to make sure that we win this fight. We need to break the monopoly of the OECD and the World Bank and the IMF on these tax rules and make sure that they work for us. We need to set a minimum wealth tax that should be progressive so that we can generate the resources that we need to fund our public services. However, right now, no international body is looking into it. For example, the IMF says we support wealth taxation, but in all of the IMF programs, we see no presence of this tax and no capacity building around it for countries. We need to look at digital taxation as companies are generating from profits, and these profits are generated by users all across the global south. So we are the product, and we are not seeing the profits or the benefits coming from the use of us as product. Finally, we need to ensure that this convention and its terms of reference and its associated protocols include the language of inclusivity. We need to see terms such as fair and equitable taxation. We need to see things like tax justice. We need to see language around these tax rules being gender just and gender responsive in the actual texts, and also in the policies that are generated from these texts. And we must make sure that the Africa group is united and speaking with one voice on all of these issues, as well as collaborating with other global South groups to ensure, such as Latin America or the Asian bloc, to ensure that the rules, mechanisms, and the language of the convention reflect issues relevant to the continent, tailored to the needs and capacities of all countries rather than a select few. And here, an example of the distractions is the recent international tax task force that is supposed to be a parallel body to the UN Convention. But we need to make sure that that does not distract us. We need to make sure that all of the discussion around tax rules happen at the UN, that is an accessible, democratic body that is not exclusionary of our countries and of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahar, for keeping to time and for simplifying it as who is overpaying or underpaying, and that's mostly women who are overpaying and corporates that are underpaying. I'll now move to our second speaker, who is Lucky Star Miandazi. Lucky Star is the current advisor for tax and domestic revenue mobilization with the African Union Commission. Prior to that, she was a tax specialist with the UNDP, working on Africa's tax and sustainable development goals initiatives. So the two questions for Lucky Star is, how can the African Union promote systemic gender change systemic gender injustices? Which bold steps can it take to promote economic justice for women? What kind of initiatives can African leaders and feminist movements take to advance this? And how can we deliver a feminist international tax system, but in terms of the role that the AU can deliver on this? Thank you and welcome. You can take it from there.
Thank you very much. So I will just ride on what we've been discussing for the past 2 days, and especially what was discussed yesterday also, as the previous speaker said, on the panel on taxation and gender. I think when you take it at an international level, as also I think one of the panelists mentioned, we're more than 100+ years, or I think it was 300 years to achieve gender equality. And this does have implications when it comes to issues of taxation. At the African Union, we have a gender strategy that we have adopted, and it was adopted also by our heads of state. And this deals with a lot of issues, including the broader issue of women's economic empowerment in society and inclusivity. And it also has the issue of fairness that is alluded to, and the contribution of women to our economies in Africa, not only via the fact that they are the ones who trade the most now that we have the AfCFTA, statistics have also shown women are the ones who are likely to pay back credits to their governments. So they contribute much more. The issue right now that we're seeing is that we're having global discussions on taxation, but we're also moving into the Financing for Development conference that will be held next year in Spain. And I think the key important issue with the FFD is that now we will have some sort of language that actually will acknowledge unpaid care work that women have been contributing, and this has not been factored into our economic statistics. And we also talked about data yesterday. So just to narrow it down, right now the AU has been involved both politically, meaning we have galvanized the support that we need from member states, and not only African member states, we have also collaborated with southern countries, global south countries, countries in PTLAC in Latin America. And these countries have been able to come together to collaborate with the AU to support the international tax framework that is currently being adopted. And the discussions that are ongoing have also shown us that by feminist movements galvanizing support, that we can actually influence some of the language that we have within the framework itself. And this language has been alluded to by various organizations, that we need to be very careful when we are looking at policy documents, and these policy documents that are going to be adopted at the international level that will speak to women's, will have an image. So it does have a face to it when we have policy documents, and we need to have a structured approach to this that has a feminist perspective. And we need to pay attention to the policy language that's going to affect women. And I think the previous speaker has pointed out where we would have some of these changes that we want to recommend. The AU has also worked diplomatically. I think this is a strong area when we look at the diplomatic relations that we have with our ambassadors in New York. We saw a great collaboration. The ambassador of New York has been present here. We've seen many ambassadors coming to join us, including right now the ambassador of Zimbabwe to Tunisia. And I think this is an important aspect, that we speak to each other, and the AU has been playing this bridge. But at the same time, it has also been playing this bridge with a perspective of inclusivity of the African women being able to be included in this discussion, and also being part of the policy making. And lastly, the AU has also involved technical. So the whole drafting process, this goes back to the issue of language. The AU has supported how we draft the documentation, and how we support the ambassadors in New York, who are the diplomats working on this, having several meetings with them just to articulate the fact that the language that is used needs to not only reflect the current issues that we're facing as African countries and developing countries in general, but it also needs to reflect the reality of the continent, where the majority of the population is the youth and is young people and is women. So this is another area that we are looking at. Now, to your other question, which talks about what we can do better in terms of I think you called it radical. That is not a word we use at the AU, but I think in this meeting, we're allowed to use that we need a radical transformation of some of the tax issues. So again, I'll ride on the previous speaker who mentioned, number one of the key issues that we want to look at with the framework, the international framework, is the issue of cross-border taxation. This for us ties on to the AFCFTA and trade in Africa. And what it means is that even women who are who own small businesses, who trade across borders, are protected, and they're considered when it comes to the issue of taxation at the international level, meaning that we're not letting multinationals avoid taxes and then targeting the women who are trading across their countries in Africa with higher taxes. So this is one of the things that we're pushing for, to be included at the international level, that will have great implications in terms of policy making at the national level. We're also looking at the issue of digitalization of taxes. And I want to give an example of the mobile phone. When we think digitalization, we of course go to AI these days. We go to our laptops and things like that. But in Africa, especially in my country of origin, in Kenya, we started M-Pesa. And one of the statistics about M-Pesa, for those who don't know, is mobile money transfers. And one of the things that it proved in its first year was the number of women that use the transaction, not only to take care of their families, but also to send money for their businesses, to receive money from their children. So the women were the ones who were paying the taxes that were being taxed on mobile transfer. They were the highest number in Kenya. So we also need to think about digitalization in terms of the implications that it has on taxation of African countries. So not only multinational companies, which we really need to tax them, but we also need to think about the implications of the revenue we get from digitalization and how that will also help enable some of this digital transfers that we have in Africa and the methods we use that women are depending on the most. The other thing that we are looking at is wealth taxation. I think the previous speaker did mention wealth taxation, but I just want to highlight the biggest issue on wealth taxation for African countries right now at the UN is that at the G20, which the African Union is a member of, we have heard and we have seen the proposal on wealth taxation, which we fully support. But our question is the divide that's going to be there. How do we get back the money, which ties on to the issue of illicit financial flows, is that we can talk about capturing this money, but how does it come back to influence our economies, back to be injected back in our economies to pay for healthcare? I, of course, need not to mention that majority of the wealthy people are, of course, men. We're also thinking about the high net worth individuals in our country, that when this money is captured, we need to ensure that it's injected back into our budgets. So this I will link to the whole of government approach, that our institutions talk to each other. The thing that is interesting about our continent is that we always have a ministry that is the Ministry of Gender, Youth and Children. I don't know why, but we also need to not separate that from the ministries of finance, from the revenue authority, from the banks. And I think this platform has shown us that in as much as we are diverse, there is commonalities, as we've heard from Supreme Auditors, we've heard from central banks, we've heard from the Ministry of Finance, Foreign Affairs. So we need to bring all these people to the table. And this is the key role that the AU is currently playing, including within this platform. And then last but not least is the issue of climate taxation. Now, I put this last purposefully because I know that, again, my country has been a big champion of climate taxes in Kenya. But we all know as Africa that we are not the highest emitters, but we are the ones who will suffer the most. And how will we suffer? Because even our agriculture will suffer. And who are the biggest actors in the agricultural sector? Women. So this is why we also need to target this within the international framework on taxation. It might be put as an early protocol, but we also need to look at the wording of this. Now, in conclusion, I'll say the same thing as the previous speaker, that the wording of our international framework on taxation not only needs to reflect the idea of inclusivity, meaning women also have to be on the table, and within the Bureau, we are very happy that there is a representation of women, but inclusivity in terms of also the language we use, in terms of what we are looking at, the implications of this high-level policy, because it will be a framework. If people and countries sign on to it, it will have great implications on our national laws that we eventually make and our policymakers adopt. So we need to look at that. We also need to look at the language around fairness. And what fairness means. For us, it means a fair share of the taxation of the global tax, and that's we have been calling for. But this fair taxation also has a feminist perspective, and it needs to look at a gender balance in this regard. And last but not least, one of the great things that we need to do, and especially I urge feminist movements that are in this room today, is to continue working with policymakers. And because most of the time you will be asked how this issue is linked to gender, and it's seen as a minor issue. But when you link it to issues of education, which this year for the African Union is the year of education, if you women and girls being included in the sector, if you link it to the issue of healthcare, as was mentioned, maternal health, life expectancies in our country, this becomes real issues, and then we are able to work with it. So to approach and to work with these people to create our policymakers, diplomats, bankers, a whole of government approach to make them aware and create this awareness about the linkages between taxation, not only at the national, regional level, but also at the international level and its implication on gender. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucky Star, for taking us through some of the advocacy moments that we could build on for the UN Tax Convention, including FFD and the G20. Thank you for taking us through kind of the role that the AU has been playing and now going into kind of the substance of what should be in the UN Tax Convention, including wealth tax, something on climate taxes, principles of inclusivity and fairness, which is a perfect segue to going to the next speaker who's going to talk to us about the non-negotiable feminist principles that should be in the UN Tax Convention. As the first question. So which principles should be there to ensure that we disrupt patriarchal and capitalist foundations of the global tax system, as well as how can feminist movements across Africa mobilize a radical unified front to dismantle oppressive tax policies and support the UN Tax Convention? So to answer this question, we have none other than Honorable Kanyisile Litchfield Shabalala, a former member of parliament, a former freedom fighter, former Navy admiral, and the current chairperson of the African Parliamentary Initiative on IFS and Taxation. Welcome, Shabalala.
Thank you so much. I think for me, the most difficult thing is going to add the gender lens to the UN Tax Convention. And I say that because the gender struggles of the African woman comes in a three-tier form. You have the class, I think, which is easier because that's what we are fighting against, all united as the global South. That's why you want to change the rules. You have the race. I think that's pretty much understood also, you know, though racism remains a global problem, but it's out there. Then you have the last one, which I've called the cultural, but the bastardized cultural actually, which is the most difficult. So we are not going to win the gender land struggle in the UN Tax Convention until we confront some animal in this continent called customary law. Customary law sits me very wrongly because of everything that existed pre-colonially in this continent, nothing was written down except customary law. And it wasn't written by us. You check your country's one. I know the South African one was written by Shepstein. It has a date and time, which means there was a date and time when there was no customary law in this continent. Now, it defies logic for me that all the feats and exploits that African women achieved pre-colonially here, you know, we are the only race of the three that had in BCE already a concept called the regnant queen. A queen is a queen because a queen is a queen, not a consort, not a mother queen, because they are the ruler. Now, it defies logic. All that was lost in history, but customary law stayed. And if you listen to the three principles of customary law, you'll be rubbed off the wrong way. Then you'll realize that our struggle, while the class and the race should be there, the UN Tax Convention, but we need to start within ourselves as the African continent. Because the three tenets of customary law say the man is the head of the house. Now, I don't know. If you speak a proper African language, you need to tell me if there's an idiom in your language that says that, because that's in the Quran and the Bible. And then two, because of that, the children are the property of the men. You know how many societies in Africa where the children took the surname of the mother? Or where it didn't matter, children took both surnames. But customary law came to reinforce and make sure. And then because of that, it also says the woman is the property of the men. Now here's the third one, which is still raging, especially outside of Southern Africa. It then says the law of primogeniture. So inheritance is through the firstborn son. That's why in most of our communities, when the husband dies, the whole family of the husband comes, we are burying and we are grieving. And they're already telling you, when are you vacating? Leave. The person through whom you came here is dead. We want to inherit their car, they are this, they are this, they are this. So for me, what feminist principles should go into it? I think we need to link the struggle of genderizing the UN Tax Convention with the eradication of customary law. It is not African. If we had gender equality pre-colonially, it means customary law isn't ours. But also, why is customary law so important? Why did they see it fit to write? Oh, by the way, first time it was written down was in India, and it was transported to Africa from India. Fact, tested and proven, you can go read about it. Now, why was it so important? Because remember, pre-colonially, Lucky Star touched on it a bit. The center of the economy of Africa was the African woman. We controlled agriculture, and because of that, we controlled the markets. And because of that, we controlled the economy. Also, we controlled the spirit world. It wasn't the men that were in charge of the spirit in our continent. So it was important to take the African woman out, because if you take her out, the culture is dead, the spiritual world is dead, the economy is dead. So that's why, doesn't it bother us as we speak these big concept and technical languages, Africans, that since the 50s, we've produced only 3 women presidents, 2 by default even, because Joyce Banda, somebody died. Tanzania, somebody died. So the only one that was voted in was Liberia, but I actually say even though it was default, the men had fought themselves to such a standstill that they needed a woman to come and salvage all the rubbish they'd created to clean it up. Now, as long as we concentrate the UN Tax Convention at the class struggle, which is the DFIs and the IFIs, you know, your finance development institutions, and we also concentrate it at the race struggle. We want our voice heard as the Africa group, but we forget the home ground. So we will win it there like we did with the Beijing conference, and then we'll come back and we say there should be gender focal points, and we even have countries that have the audacity to put men as the gender focal point, you know? There's no budgeting, there's no gender budgeting in our countries, there's no women equality. I mean, the country where I come from, how is it that I was safer walking during apartheid in the streets than I am safer walking in the streets now under a black government? So for me, honestly, the struggle starts at home to make sure that there's a gender lens in the UN Tax Convention, because we lost the 60s. Women were part of the liberation struggle. I viva them always. And you know, people say, oh, that's so, and I'm thinking, but it's not even a fraction of the women that are out there. How is it that we were so much part and parcel of the anti-colonial struggle, but when it was time for the so-called independence, we were forgotten? The same thing will happen with the UN Tax Convention, because who's negotiating? I know TJNA for CSOs is there, and I have such faith in them because I know their stance on gender. But that race and class level, who's negotiating? When we say the Africa group, have we unpacked and actually made a list and looked at how many men are leading this? And if those men are leading this, but in our own countries, customary law still reigns, they haven't seen it fit to abolish it, how are they going to make the gender lens really that crucial? Yes, they'll fight for the race and the class because it affects them as leaders too. But the gender one will fall on the wayside, just like it did with the liberation struggle. So for me, honestly, I don't want to belabor this. That's where I would start. Customary law must go. Honestly, with customary law, it's an African, we should own it. It breaks my heart when you go to Google today, of the 3 races, you say Caucasian race, white people, Mongoloid race, yellow people, Negroid race, black people, and you say, who does patriarchy belong to? They say Africans. How? It's an African. They gave this to us and we owned it too. And sadly, because of religion, even women have come to own customary law. So that's where the struggle starts. If we are going to see a UN convention that has a gender lens, that has the African woman's voice in it. Because remember, the global South can help us with the class. They'll help us with the race, not with that one. They are not of our culture. It's only us who can fight that struggle. And I think we have laxed a lot on that front of the struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shabalala, for reminding us about the fight that must be won at home, in our home ground. Our final speaker is Lurit Yugusuk, who is a strategist for economic justice and rights with the African Feminist, Femnet, the African Women's Development and Communication Network. And her intervention today will be about telling us what is missing within the UN Tax Convention and proposals for what feminists can do also to ensure it works for them. Welcome, Lurit.
All right, great. Good morning, everyone. Is it morning? Good morning, everyone. I'm still operating on East African time, so you may need to pardon me. Before I proceed with my interventions, I just want to ask a very interesting question in the room. For each and every one of us who are in here right now, how many of us think that the UN Tax Convention is actually a very progressive opportunity for realizing gender equality? I mean, you can throw your hands up in the air if you want to, but how many of us actually think it's a very progressive step to ensuring gender equality? I can see hands on this side. I can see hands on this side. Doesn't mean that we don't think it's progressive at all. People, are you trying to tell me you don't see it as a progressive tool at all? What's happening? Well, I always, sorry. I always ask that question because that's where it begins. Do we believe that the convention is actually the first step to progressive engagement on gender equality? Is it progressive to women's economic justice? And these are questions we need to always talk about. But very many people in the room are not bold enough to either recognize it, along we who talk about it, are not able to stand up and say, thank you for recognizing this. All right, so very many people are not bold enough to actually speak out along the lines that we consistently want to talk about. But here's why the UN Tax Convention is actually a progressive tool. One, it diverts our thoughts from the OECD-led tax governance system into a system which is actually led by the Global South. That in itself seems like a very progressive step in itself, and we can recognize that very heavily. The other thing is that it empowers our governments to exercise sovereignty over their respective tax systems. Now, these are all opportunities. Still, we live in very interesting macroeconomic times that present a challenge for how we realize women's economic justice, how we realize inclusivity, how we realize gender equality as well as women in general. And one, let's take a look at our fiscal space. Our fiscal space is heavily shrinking, and it still continues to shrink even as the years continue to go by. Why? It's because of how our economic dynamics are, all the way from debt issues, all the way from IFFs, all the way from how we govern our various tax systems. Then what does this mean? It diverts spending from social programs. When I talk about social programs, I'm talking about healthcare, education, social protection, from which very many populations, including women and girls, heavily rely on to either realize their economic justice, to either realize their gender justice, to either realize their various respective rights. The other issue is the idea of gender gaps that exist within our respective societies, not only in taxation, but also when we talk about the idea of digital transformation. There's a lot of gender gaps when it comes to that. Like you talked about the idea of mobile phones. Think about it. How many women own mobile phones? How many men own it? Do we create strategies that are cognizant of how aware our people are about digital age? Do we think about that in that particular lens? So that said, indeed, the UN Framework Convention is very useful in terms of how we think about channeling revenue for social programs. It's very useful when we think about reducing gender gaps in taxation, as well as reducing the digital gender divide. It's also very useful in promoting women's economic justice. Still, there's so many critical things that are missing and may not allow us to achieve this objective as we want to. One, the convention does not explicitly mention the idea of gender disaggregated data. So even if we proceed to have conversations on how we want to implement it, how we want to ensure a path where negotiation is inclusive, are we thinking in the lens of how gender disaggregated data will inform our various interventions with regard to the UN Tax Convention? It's important for us to think about that. The other thing is the idea of gender responsive budgeting, and my fellow panelists have heavily alluded to this. If at all the UN Tax Convention does come into play, is it explicitly clear that this is going to be married to our gender responsive budgeting, which are almost non-existent anyway? But is there this clarity in the fact that we also want to enhance our gender budgets to respond to the various needs of our populations? And in this particular case is explicitly women and girls. The other thing is engagement of women's rights organizations. Fine, they're represented in the room, but is this engagement meaningful enough to ensure, one, the transformation of the language we're talking about? We're talking about inclusive language. is the participation inclusive enough to ensure that how they prescribe this language is adopted into the framework? Beyond this is technical expertise as well. How do we embrace and prioritize technical expertise by women rights organizations? Are we considering that as a very critical element in this particular negotiations? Because they play a role in informing this engagement. Next is the language. For each and every one of us in the room, so make a deliberate effort to understand what gender just, gender inclusive language is. Because even if I prescribe it to you 1,000,000 times, if you don't take the deliberate effort to also understand what this language is, you're not able to genuinely meet me halfway. Yeah. So moving forward, as we keep thinking about the idea of gender inclusive programs, gender inclusive language, and incorporating the feminist and gender lens into the UN Tax Convention, and even conversations about the global tax system, it has to also begin with your deliberate effort to understand this process. And when it comes to the national level is how much do we want to invest in gender disaggregated data to inform our various engagements around reforming the global tax architecture? How much do we want to think about transparency and participation in this case? How deliberate are we in reforming our particular systems in order to ensure by the time we are implementing a convention, we're actually able to do this with the right intention, the right resource pack, and we're looking at it in the lens that it is actually a tool pioneer change in our respective nationals. I mean, later on, we can come up with how we can do this, but for now, I think these are my submissions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laureate, for alerting us to the need for data collection and specifically gender disaggregated data collection. I will now open the floor to any questions from the plenary. Just as you start thinking about any questions you might have, Akina Mama, okay, we have one at the front and two. Akina Mama Africa has made a submission to the ad hoc committee of experts on the UN Tax Convention development of terms of reference. So if you want to have a look at that, you should be able to see it online soon. So we'll have the lady at the front and then the one at the back.
Can you hear me? Sure. So my
Yes,
name
we can.
is Gifty from the Parliament of Ghana. So based on my argument on what Lucky Star shared about fairness and equality in the tax system, according to ILO's survey of 2019 report, which indicates that 96.2% of women's care work globally amount to amount of $100 trillion annually, contributing 30% to the global GDP. And in Ghana, our survey, statistical surveys reports for 2020 also indicated that 23% of our country's GDP is contributed to women's unpaid care work, which contributes to the global GDP. Now, in considering this UN tax convention that we are looking at, I don't know how we are considering factoring women's care unpaid work that is the basis of the home, basis of the economy, to be able to give a fair taxing regime to women so that there is equality, there is gender clarity and fairness in the global arena. I want us to look at this, and if there's any clarification that the panelists can speak to, I'd appreciate to hear of it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the other question at the back before we go back to the panelists.
Je m'excuse. Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Tout d'abord, je voudrais féliciter nos chers dames pour vos brillantes présentations. Juste, j'ai une remarque concernant la présentation de Sahal. Sahal, je m'excuse, mais je ne suis pas tout à fait d'accord avec vous en disant qu'il faut totalement supprimer les avantages fiscaux. Parce que les avantages fiscaux sont mis en place par le gouvernement ou par l'État pour encourager certaines régions ou certains secteurs vulnérables. Donc, à mon avis, il faut néanmoins renforcer le contrôle au sein de l'administration fiscale. Il faut recruter des agents compétents qu'on puisse lutter contre l'évasion fiscale. Merci.
Oh, there's a request. Would you like to restate the question? Okay, Sahar will restate the question.
So she was asking, she was saying that we shouldn't cancel all tax incentives, and that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's a very high cost and we need to review them, not only in terms of which ones are legitimate and which ones are facilitating the illicit financial flows, but also which ones are effective to our objectives and which one aren't. Because even if a tax incentive is being legitimately used, but it's costing us more than we are getting from it. For example, we're encouraging a certain sector so we can create jobs for it. But if the cost per job is more than what we can just give to that person as like contribution, then that tax incentive, even if it is being legitimately used, needs to be scraped. And we need to move towards social spending rather than hoping and counting on the goodwill of corporations to redistribute wealth and income. But I can also address the unpaid care work question. Okay, so thank you for the numbers that you give, and I want to build on it to give the number of hours that women in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa work. So in terms of unpaid care work, Sub-Saharan African women work on average is minutes per day, around 250 minutes, and men work around basically 90 minutes. So women are putting in 3 times as much time in unpaid care work as men. And then when we look at paid work, we find that women on average are spending 100 minutes less than men on paid work. But when you look at the total, women are working more. So they're working more and getting paid less. And that's part of the issue on how we can address this this problem. One of the main pillars and solutions is to transfer this care work into public sector. Basically, we need to fund services such as childcare, elder care, care for people with disabilities, to basically share the burden, not only within the household between men and women, but also between the household and the state, to make sure that women have the time, effort, and capabilities to move beyond the household and beyond the unpaid care work and into formal sector where they have social protection, where they have decent work conditions, where they have decent job wages, etc. So all of that is relating to taxation, because we need to mobilize enormous resources to fund these services. And that resource mobilization needs to be sustainable, it needs to be fair, and all of that we can do through fair and just taxation. And this is why, for example, when we talk about what we were talking about in terms of men inheriting most of the wealth, this is why we need tax on wealth. We need wealth taxation. It's to redistribute all of these assets so women can build on them and be able to have their independence and be able to take care of their communities as well. So I hope that addresses the question on the link between unpaid care work and taxation. So thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. I'll allow each speaker to respond to any or both of the questions that have been asked, as well as to make any concluding remarks. You will each have a go to answer any or both and to make any concluding remarks. So
Thank you.
yeah, please go ahead.
So maybe I just also want to add something onto the very good question on tax incentives. Tax incentives need to be driven by a cost-benefit analysis. We need to understand that we're still developing countries that need to attract investments, but when we look at countries that are giving the highest number of tax incentives, are those translating into into roads, infrastructure that are going to be used? Are women getting the jobs that they need to get? So we also need to get this balance. And I think the number that was put on what we lose in terms of tax incentives, which is, I think, US dollars a year. I think this should be something that really wakens us up as African countries to really look at this. And this also goes into budgets, because tax incentives in most of our countries are debated on at parliament. So I just want to say that this is one of the areas that Africa Union is working on, building capacities for countries to be able to analyze these tax incentives. I always joke as a lawyer that when you look at a double taxation agreement, for example, which most of the times does include some taxes that are exempt for these multinationals, you think, oh, what can truly be bad in 6 pages? And I think all the lawyers in the room can tell you how many provisions we can put in 6 pages of a double taxation agreement. So it's mostly about analyzing this and then seeing if it does translate into transformative benefits for the country, and especially for women, in terms of employment, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of also what's being provided by this company. Are they providing healthcare coverage? Are they providing education opportunities that they've promised? And I've seen countries, including, I think the latest was Gabon, that is really rethinking some of its tax incentives in this regard. And that can be something that is seen. And I think also some of the people from the ministry, and especially the Commissioner General yesterday, alluded to some of the things that she's doing within the revenue administration here in Tunisia, to even look at what companies are doing here in Tunisia, which also is on tax incentives and how to revise them. And then the question from Madam Gifty, I think she asked a very important question. So I always say we need to understand how the UN works. So you see, for example, over the past 2 days, one of the questions have been the feedbacks that I've received as the organizer is that not too many people on the panel. At the UN, you have 3 minutes because we have, and your mic will go off. So you need to say what you want to say in 3 minutes. And I'm of course looking also at Mr. Daniel, who has the experience on this. So with the UN processes, this is why I'm saying that it's very important for us to work together, because to get in the feminist idea of putting it onto the UN framework for 100 and something countries within the UN, that will definitely come. We've never seen the kind of reaction that we've had over a technical issue such as tax, but all countries now realize the implications of this and are sending representatives. But that's why we need to work together. And I just also wanted to answer Madam Kanisile. So just to merge the two answers between you and Madam Kanisile, is the fact that when we work together, the Bureau does have a lot of women actually, but when we work together, we have a stronger voice and we have a common African position, which is what we're doing. If we put within that common African position perspectives on gender, if we put that we are concerned that the face of Africa, it's both men and women, but majority of which is women, then we are able to articulate this at the UN within 3 minutes. We are going to have protocols, and this is what is currently being discussed. We can try and get a protocol on gender, which I would not advise, because this is the issue, is that something like gender is not for one protocol. It touches on climate change, as I discussed. It touches on wealth tax. It touches on the extractive sector. It touches on cross-border taxation. It touches on IFS, tax-related IFS, criminal, corrupt, and commercial. So we need to make sure that in each of these documents, we have people in the room who understand the issue and can really articulate the issue in the 3 minutes that's needed, but also work with the Africa group to ensure that some of these documents that we submit are indeed reflective of the continent. And we're here for that, totally. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucky Star. I'll invite Dr. Shabalala and Laureate if you had any additions to make and concluding remarks.
Thanks. I think to the question on tax incentives, have we ever realized that we've already given tax incentives by allowing multinationals to pay our workers low wages than what they pay in other countries? In 2014 in South Africa, when the Marikana strike broke out and those rock drill operators were asking for peanuts, 12,500 a month. I mean, can't live on that amount. Lonmin truly said, we can't deliver this. If we do, we are going to go under. But the same Lonmin in Australia pays rock drill operators a salary of middle management in South Africa. And then a report came out that between 2000 and 2015, which is within that period, the platinum industry, because that was a platinum mine, was siphoning out of South Africa millions of rands in profit shifting. So I don't think any African country, any self-respecting in any case, should be giving tax incentives. We have already given them by allowing them to pay our workers low. And remember, pay as you earn is linked to how much you earn. So we are already robbing ourselves even there. So we don't need tax incentives, I argue. On the question of unpaid work again, see, as long as customary law sees you as a bride, listen to the songs we sing when people get married. You know, I'm such a protester that there are things I have stopped attending in my life or stopped singing. There's a Zulu song for a bride, umakoti wethu uzoswashela siphekele. Here comes the bride, he's come to cook and clean. Hello? And we sing these songs as women and we dance to them. You know, my first marriage lasted 5 years because it was in the Eastern Cape. I got there and the following morning they woke me up and said, where's breakfast? I said, I don't know. Maybe at Mark and Bean, maybe at Wimpy. I also don't know. I'm just like you. I don't know where's breakfast. So, you know, if we don't put ourselves on the line to challenge these patriarchal norms, as Lucky Star says, we need everybody. If we are going to say it's their fight, while we are not fighting from individual and organizational level, we are going to continue to have unpaid work because it's a global South problem. She said North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. I say it's an African problem. It's global South, but mainly it's an African problem. And again, it's because of customary law. Because as the woman, you are seen to be this piece of machine that it's normal for you to have 3 jobs. It's normal for for when I get sick, it's normal for my husband to say, I can't take care of her. I don't mean mine, but my husband taught me never say they, personalize it with you. It's normal that when he's sick, he says, I can only make eggs. Then they must call Lucky Star, my sister, to come and look after me. What did he sign in the vows? So, you know, we allow these things. So for me, honestly, unpaid care work is directly linked to customary law. We need to challenge that law. We need to stop being the property of the men. We need to stop our kids being the property of the husband, which is why they take them away sometimes and even chase you without them and tell you the children belong here. We need to stop it. We need to look at what was our pre-colonial gender construct. Because there's a magic word in South Africa, Zulu, Xhosa, Ndebele, and Swati called ubulungisa, which is justice. And it's even to say justice is a weak thing because ubulungisa pre-colonially for us meant a constant act of balancing restorative justice, which is where we were. Where we are now, that's bastardized African culture. It needs to be challenged in all its formation if we are going to have a voice as feminists in the UN Tax Convention.
Okay, great. I think for me, I'm going to answer the question on unpaid care work by actually giving you 2 or 3 interesting statistics. So one is, it is estimated that the monetary value of women's unpaid care work globally is as mind-blowing as 10.8 trillion US dollars annually. And this is an amount that is 3 times the size of the world's tech industry. Second, very many studies, all the way from the ILO to UNCTAD to the UN Women, highlight that if valued monetarily, unpaid care work could represent a substantial portion of GDP, exceeding up to 40% in some countries. Again, 42% of women across the globe cannot get decent jobs because they're responsible for all the caregiving, compared to a mere 6% of men. Why am I bringing out these 3 statistics? We're in a situation where so many African countries are grappling with mobilization. They're having consistent challenges of raising the requisite revenue to ensure their economic and social development. Yet we have an entire industry here which is able to contribute up to 10.8 trillion US dollars. Do you see that there's a link there in the sense that we can actually raise revenue through this particular side of things, if at all we're deliberate about recognizing the value of unpaid care work, looking into how we're distributing unpaid care work in our respective societies, if 42% of a population is able to work in an informal sector and is able to contribute to such an amount, yet we're consistently seeing that our fiscal space is shrinking. We're in a situation where we're saying we cannot raise enough revenue. Why then are we not able to look into this other side of things and actually say that, you know what, perhaps if we value this accordingly, if we recognize this accordingly, we're able to actually ensure that our tax base is well taken care of? Questions we need to also ask ourselves. And Riva, if you can just allow me to think about what advocacy would look like in this lens is considering the questions that are coming from the table, all the way from tax incentives to unpaid care work and everything. It's literally showing that we need more and more awareness about the intersectionality of these various issues and the global financial architecture, the global tax architecture. What is the intersectionality between these critical issues? It's important for us to have much research, as much information, as much awareness creation as possible on these critical issues so that we're able to understand whether this indeed is an appropriate tax base to tap into. Is it indeed a way that we can contribute to our economic and social development? And these are things we need to think about collectively and create a force where we're able to collaboratively engage on these various issues in a way that allows us to look way broadly at all these kind of issues and how they intersect with the conversation on progressive tax systems. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to take any more questions, but thank you so much to our panelists, Lucky Star, Lloyd, Dr. Shabalala, and Sahar. Thank you so much for your interventions and your questions. We will have to end the session here because I believe there's another one coming on. Just to summarize some of the key points, we need to be explicit about gender justice and the unpaid care and domestic work within the tax convention, but also in our personal fights on the ground, including in customary law. We need to recognize all the different ways in which the opportunities, including FFD, including G20. We need to look at the different ways that this can happen at the national level, including gender responsive budgeting, including rationalizing our harmful tax incentives, looking at meaningful transparency and accountability in the public participation of women at the local level, reviewing double taxation agreements, and how this can also affect reparative justice and climate justice. So thank you so much. See you at next sessions. While I have the mic, just to unashamedly promote the Oxfam session at 12:30 in room in corporate accountability, IFS, and inequality. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. So now we are going for the tea break and we are coming back in 15 minutes. So thank you, everyone.
They always agree with us, then they want to. Oh, you just. Oh, this is also good for us. Yeah, this. Now, tea break. No, I will find out.
Hello, Pooja. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hi, Brian, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Speaking.
Hello, I can hear you.
Oh, I can hear as well.
I don't have a sound here.
Your sound. Are you getting it?
I am speaking, but I guess you can't hear me.
Yes. 1 minute. 1 minute, please. Hi, Pooja. Can you try one more again? One more time, please.
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Is okay?
No?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Oh. Oh, we were testing it. One more time, please.
Can you hear me?
Time, please. One last time, please. Pooja.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, listen.
They want me to keep trying and testing to make sure it's okay. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. All right. Do you have a presentation or anything like that? Or it's just you'll just be speaking?
I'll just be speaking. No presentation.
All right, cool. Thank you so much. And do you want to test your video?
Sorry?
Do you want to test your video?
Yes, sure.
Thank you. Okay.
We can see you very clearly.
Okay, great.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we want to start this session so that we do not run out of time. If you're sitting too far, and you can see the general direction of my eyesight, if you are sitting too far, I'm not referring to you directly, but if you are sitting too far, we request that you come a little bit closer so that you get to enjoy this session, and we also get to see you as you look at us, and we also are able to see your questions when you raise your hand. On this session, which is co-organized by the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and Tax Justice Network Africa, we will be talking about the various destructive or distractions that are moving our eyesight away from the real goal, which is to achieve a reform of the international financial architecture at the UN. I am joined by an esteemed panel. I have Grace Anamugambe, who is from Femnet at my extreme left. I also have Chennai Mukumba from Tax Justice Network Africa. I also have Dereje from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And I also have Shem Joshua, who is from Aphrodite. Just thinking about the number of organizations represented here, I know that we would need a lot of time to actually be able to go through the world of knowledge that is represented here. But before we start enjoying the fun, I know somebody will have come in to ring the bell to tell us that we have run out of time. However, it is important to lay it this way, that even as we are thinking about reforms of the international financial architecture, and I forgot to mention that we have an esteemed colleague who is joining us online from the Society for International Development, Pooja. I don't know whether we can be able to see Pooja on the screen. I know my colleagues in the background are working on that. Pooja, we want to welcome you, and we hope that you're able to follow and you can hear us clearly. I know that my technical team is helping us with that. Pooja, we apologize that we could not have you physically, but we are happy to welcome you. And to kick us off, I thought that it would be important to actually mention that in the big push for reforms of the international financial architecture, there has emerged other processes, there has emerged other platforms that are promising that if we ascribe and we follow those platforms, we might achieve the reforms of the international financial architecture that we seek to see. These new processes and platforms are backed by very powerful players. They have been launched with a lot of razzmatazz, but this panel will help me unpack Are they the rightful channels? Are they the rightful platforms? Will they deliver? Or should we keep our eyes on the ball? And to kick us off, I want to ask Shem to come in and comment. When it comes to debt, we have processes like the G20 Common Framework. Will it deliver? Over to you, Shem.
Thank you, Francis, for that. I think I'm audible enough. On your question regarding whether the G20 Common Framework will deliver, I think this is a question that we have to take into consideration, not just with yes or no, but deep diving some of the reason to why G20 Common Framework was put in place. And when you look at the G20 Common Framework, which just came after the DSSI, you'll realize that even its name alone, the G20 Common Framework, it should show the common perspective of all creditors. But from how it's being implemented, there is some demerits in terms of the implementation. And so at this point, I will say that without changing the way the framework itself, how it works, then it might not deliver. And these are the reasons to why the G20 Common Framework might not deliver when you look at the Africa economies. The G20 Common Framework excludes the private creditors, even from the conversation itself. And when you look at the, Africa debt landscape, you'll realize over 40%, actually 40% of our debt is on the credit landscape. And it's also on not putting more emphasis on the importance of the creditors to look onto how the debtors' economies are running. Because in the long run, you'll realize that the G20 Common Framework, it is not common as per se, and that makes it very elusive in nature. Africa debt has increased over time, and this has not really been the best case scenario when you look at the policies that have been put in place to try and help Africa economies restructure some of their debts. And I think with the G20 Common Framework's availability or inception, there is need for it to be restructured. And I have to say that because currently only 4 Africa countries submitted to the G20 Common Framework, which is not really working for them. When you look at Ghana, when you look at Zambia, Ethiopia and Ethiopia, Ghana, Ethiopia, Chad, and Zambia, you'll realize that there is a problem in terms of how the creditors is being, how debtors are being involved even in the debt restructuring process. And that make it difficult even for the countries to understand exactly how the G20 Common Framework is working. After all, remember G20 Common Framework is not in any way constitutionally obligated to the global economies. It's like friendly party agreement that does not really provide a framework of how we need to consider the best strategies in a way that debt restructuring should not just be about the creditor-centric, but also taking into consideration the debtors' concern. Africa economies understand how the economies are going, in terms of the available resources, debt to GDP, tax to GDP. But you'll realize that these are not taken into consideration because there is no clear framework or the clear ways in which Africa economies are being involved in the discussion. And when you look at of recent what happened in Zambia, you'll realize that the conditionalities that comes with the debt restructuring process alone makes it even difficult for Africa economies to achieve some of the Agenda 2063, because one way or the other, you are being told you have to look onto the austerity measures, but this is coming back to the basic provisions, including education, including health, social protections, the social sectors. So whenever these are being advised in terms of how you need to go about them, you realize that it's not easy for us to achieve our Agenda 2063. And so the G20 Common Framework as it is now is not working until there will be a need to look to reframe the process and make it work. To make it creditor-centric in nature, in a way that even the private creditors should also be included in the conversation. So I think that's what I can start with. And Francis.
Thank you so much, Shem. I think you have posed very good questions around, is the G20 common framework really common? You have also clearly showed that only 4 African countries at present are subscribed to the G20 common framework. You have also actually said there's no obligation for actually that process delivering the results that it seeks to achieve, and it still is very creditor-centric. But as we are talking about reforms of the international financial architecture, that's on debt. Let's talk about financing for development. Let's hear from Pooja. Pooja, as you're getting to our going that are related to financing for development. Indeed, we know that we have now even received, we know that we are now working towards the FFD4 process. We are doing preps. The preps are actually going, the prep meeting is actually coming to Addis very soon. Will it deliver the results that we seek to see? Pooja, over to you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Can I just check that you can hear me well? Is the connection good?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Pooja with Society for International Development, and we facilitate the civil society financing for development mechanism, which is the open civil society platform that is engaged in the UN's FFD process, as well as other issues to do with global finance in the UN. I think to answer this question, maybe just to give a little bit of a historical context to why we have this process on FFD in the UN. It emerges from decades of fight by global South countries in the United Nations to establish a new international economic order and to ensure that all decision-making on issues of global finance happens in the United Nations. So the first FFD conference, which was in 2002, happened as a result of several decades of discontent of global South countries with the reality that issues on global finance continues to happen outside the UN, such as the World Bank, IMF, OECD, G7, and so on and so on. And of course, the decisions impacts all countries, especially global South countries, but they don't get to be part of making those decisions. And so there's been a long struggle, not just, of course, on tax, but similarly also on sovereign debt, for instance, to try and establish processes in the UN that would allow all global South countries to be part of norm setting and standard setting on these central issues of global finance. And of course, one of the ways, we're talking about distractions. There are a couple of things that has always happened. One is this issue of distractions outside the UN. So I know we'll also be hearing more of that from the panel. So all the attempts that continues to be made to keep these decisions outside the UN, to weaken global South solidarity on these issues. And so that's a constant tension. The other issue is distractions also within the United Nations. So the call by global South countries is to establish intergovernmental negotiation and decision-making processes in the UN. So the calls are around, for example, UN Tax Convention. Similarly, there's been a long-standing call to have a UN legal framework on sovereign debt. So it is about having the legal frameworks, the norms, the standards, decisions, and commitments. So that's the substantive work that continues to happen outside the UN. But often what happens in terms of distractions within the UN is there's always an attempt to instead set up talk shops, these big performative summits, saying there's a high-level dialogue. So it's about the narrative of UN is the place you go for making speeches and having round tables, but the actual decisions and the substantive work, let's be real, UN is not the place for it. So that's always another challenge even within the UN. We have seen, for instance, even on tax attempts such as the FACTI panel that many in the audience might be familiar with, where one of our concerns was that this was coming off of years of a struggle of G77 to establish an intergovernmental process, not a technical process. And so there was a lot of concerns around this proving to be a distraction. It will delay the decision to actually establish an intergovernmental process. So we see all of these attempts generally to say we need more technical analysis, we need more technical reports, we need technical panels, or we need high-level discussions. All of these are ways to distract from the core, which is that we need decision-making intergovernmental processes led by member states. And so that's what we have with the UN Tax Convention process. So maybe I'll stop there. I know you have a long list of speakers. Happy to get back to any of this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pooja, for actually reminding us that when it comes to distractions, I know we have looked at distractions from the debt side, but then Pooja, you bring in an interesting perspective to look at distractions from outside the UN and distractions actually within the UN itself. And you make a good point of actually reminding us that some of these distractions are to weaken the Global South solidarity. And it is important for us as we are thinking about these reforms to actually know that the push to make the UN look like we only go there as the talk shop and there's no real action and the real action is outside, we should move away from that. But to drill deeper into the other side, Dereje, please come in and talk about the OECD. Is it distracting us? Is it going to deliver? Is it the right place? Over to you.
Thank you very much. OECD is not only distracting us, but also trying to destroy us. Let me start with the first thing. That is, who gave OECD the mandate to rule the world? It is a club of the rich. It's a membership organization committed to advance the interests of its members. It is a legitimate function. It becomes problematic when it assumes the role of rulemaking on behalf of the rest of the world. So what happened was the OECD started to reform the global tax in its own manner and started what is called a BEPS project, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project. It was in 2013. We were campaigning for a UN-based reform process. And we had a slogan which said, if you are not on the table, you are on the menu. What happened 2015 was a Financing for Development conference in Addis. The outcome document was not signed in the UN at the UN in New York during the run-up to the conference because they could not agree on one issue. There was one paragraph which called on behalf of the G77 to create a UN tax body. The OECD countries, led by the US, said, if you have this in the paragraph, we are not going to negotiate. That was what they said, and then it was happening in Addis. The Ethiopian government then didn't want the UN conference to fail. They put pressure on the G77 countries to withdraw this call for a UN tax body. And the G77 made a declaration at that time. South Africa was chairing it. They said, we will withdraw it for the sake of maintaining the success of the conference, that the conference is concluded, but will not give up the call for a UN tax body. So now what happened? They had to withdraw. The OSCE started a perfidious mechanism of creating what it called an inclusive framework and calling on countries to come for to join it for a rule-making process. It was the Secretariat of the OECD is the convener, a manipulative structure. There was nothing public about it. There was nothing. It was opaque. It was transparent. Even ATAF, which has an observer status, said there is a lot of political pressure there. Anyway, it brought together this now 130 countries, but it is jurisdictions, not countries. The UK is represented with all its secrecy tax havens. Cayman Islands a member. All British Virgin Islands a member. So with all these things, UK is represented at least 7-8 times. Anyway, the whole process started. G24 and others try to influence the output, but we call it any input from developing countries in the inclusive framework process is like a ship passing Bermuda Islands. It just disappears. So the OECD anyway pulled it further, but what happens, I have to be fast, is it has not delivered. It concluded 5 minimum standards. Its major member, the US, has not signed on it. They are trying to force African countries to sign it who are not part of the negotiations. The US has not signed it. The Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 solution, it is a lie that they are agreeing on it. Just the other day, Canada, which had suspended its digital service tax, reintroduced it because the Pillar 1 is not delivering. The French Prime Minister, the Finance Minister was saying, if the OECD process is stalling, we have to reintroduce the digital service tax. Because to agree to the Pillar 1, you have to renounce a unilateral measure to introduce digital service tax. That is why the Nigeria Revenue Authority both said, the OECD reform will make us tax companies which are taxing now less than what is happening now. Okay, I cannot go into the details, but at any rate, it is not a process leading anywhere. The US, under no circumstances, is going to sign it. We thought they might sign it just to have for the propaganda purpose and renege on ratifying. But they are not even going to sign it because it is an election year. They will not even be wanted to be put in the same. They don't want that the US Senate thinks that the US is in the process of ratifying it. So it is not delivering, but why is it being, it is being used only to obstruct the UN process. It is not delivering and it is preventing others from delivering. So what is now happening at the UN? The worrying thing is, what they are saying is, there should not be any duplicity. The OECD is in a process of delivering. The UN should focus on something the OECD has not done. And then what happens is the UN is going to be tasked to do minor things which are not fundamental, which do not have anything with governance issues, which does not fundamentally reform the current international tax rules. And then the OECD will be the one dealing with corporate taxation, rulemaking, and standard setting. So this is a situation which they want to impose. They failed to do that because the Africa group led the process and got the full support of G77 countries to push forward this agenda. This has been so successful so far. That is why now they are coming through the back door. Why? Okay, is OECD operating the techniques? So anyway, what should keep us worried is what they are saying is there should be no duplication. And I was honestly, I have to be frank, I'm an African and I'm concerned was what African institutions say. I was worried when there was a talk of reconciling. It is not reconcilable. Oligarchy cannot be democratized. They are afraid and they don't want to be equals. So why should we leave the house in which we are recognized equal members and go to another forum in which we are tolerated, in which our interests are not represented at all? Or we are, we have to know this is not about ODA. This is about our taxing rights. It is about taxing multinational companies for the profit they have generated in our economies. The OECD reform, Pillar 1, has only maximum 100 companies in its scope and redistributes through a very funny formula, only up to 10% of the global income, the global profit of multinationals, only 10%. The 90% proceeds the same way like now, which facilitates profit shifting, which makes countries, jurisdictions like the Isle of Jersey, the major exporters of banana to the rest of Europe. It is how the business is structured and what is allowed under the current prevailing system, which is facilitating illicit tax dodging per se. That is why I am afraid also this is one of the distractions when we are being pushed back to focus on only the criminal aspects of illicit financial flows. The biggest mischief is done through profit shifting. So the distractions have two characters really. One is to empty the content of the UN Tax Convention by making it less comprehensive, by bringing into it things like capacity building, cooperation of revenue authorities, and by leaving the major task of international tax rules in the hands of the OECD. And the OECD countries are the ones who are saying it is a duplication, let OECD complete the work. But none of the 27 African countries at the UN, who are also members of the inclusive framework, have ever said, we are doing it at the OECD, let's leave it here. They are all saying we have to complete it there. So now, there is no reason for us to say the two processes should merge. It is not possible to merge them. If we want to claim back our taxing rights globally, we have to pursue the UN process. And the OECD, instead of asking us to take its package, whether we like it or not, let them submit it for vote at the UN.
Thank you, Dereje.
If they know that they are doing it for the interest of others, why don't they unpack it? Let the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 be submitted at the UN. Let it be voted. Instead of taking us out of the process and taking us to Paris and then force us to sign on it or use it as an excuse to scuttle the UN process, let them present it at the UN. The members of inclusive framework are also members of the UN. Let them get majority for it. Let them not trick. Let it be in an open democratic process. We have our suggestions, proposals for a UN tax convention. Let them also present theirs there and let the majority of countries decide.
Thank you.
Anything which deviates us from this process is deviation to obstruct the process of reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very hard to stop you, Dereje. And I don't know, why did the recording stop? Did we know what was coming up? Anyway, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I think you make it very clear. You started by a mic drop saying that they are not just distracting us. They seek to destroy us. And if you want to refer to conversations that we have had in this room, we even have non-inclusive framework countries that are actually implementing standards that have been proposed at the inclusive framework. But to take this conversation forward, I want us to move to Chennai, who will speak about other processes like the new global compact, the new global financial pact that is being pushed by none other but President Ruto, President Macron. Chennai, are these distractions?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I think I echo what's been said in the sense that as we are starting to now see momentum at the UN, there does seem to be, not there does seem to be, there actually are a growing number of initiatives that are also being proposed to reform the global tax system. And I think to use the words that we're discussing now, these can serve and are serve the purpose of operating as distractions when you consider the potential that lies within what's currently being discussed at the UN. And so, when I make reference to these different initiatives, I'm speaking to, for example, there's a current discussion that's currently taking place on global wealth taxation that's being spearheaded by the G20. There is also another conversation that's happening on what's being called the International Tax Task Force, which, as you've mentioned, Francis, is being spearheaded by Kenya, France, and now Barbados has come on board as the co-chair. So I want to speak a little bit about specifically the ITTF, the International Tax Task Force, and what it's proposing and why it in itself potentially is drawing away resources that we need to be currently putting in place at the UN. So this particular task force was has been initiated by the European Climate Foundation. It was an outcome of the 2023 Paris Summit for a New Financial Pact, as well as the Africa Climate Summit. It was then officially announced at the COP28 by both France and Kenya. I actually remember, because I attended the COP last year, when I received this notification and information about this fact, being really confused because it was round about the time conversations were happening at the UN about this UN tax convention. Resolution 78/230 had just been adopted. And this resolution was essentially the resolution that was to establish the Intergovernmental Ad Hoc Committee, as well as set out what meetings needed to happen this year in terms of establishing the terms of reference. The reason I think it's important to have these conversations is because one of the things we've discussed and is also prevalent whenever talking about international tax cooperation conversations, particularly developing countries and African countries in this context, we have limited resources. And so when we find ourselves stretched, to borrow from a question that was asked on the first day, where should we be prioritizing our efforts? And to now speak to the current conversation, ideally, we need to be investing our resources in the platform that will allow for equal participation, a recognition of the priorities, needs, as well as concerns of the Africa group, as well as developing countries much more broadly. So with regards to this ITTF, there's two specific objectives that it's. The first is to put forward proposals and promote international agreements on one or several tax options. The second objective of the ITTF is to generate more fairness and equity in the current global tax system, which is interesting, right? When you consider what's supposed to be the objective of what's currently taking place at the UN. So in a sense, you see a level of duplication with regards to what's being proposed on the ITTF, as well as what's currently taking place at the UN. The reason this is also particularly important, drawing from what Direja just said, one of the areas of tension when you think about what's being championed by the Africa group is this whole conversation of duplication. The OECD EU countries essentially are indicating that it's important that the UN conversation not duplicate what's already been done at the OECD. The Africa group are of the view that all discussions that have taken place I see this is not working. All discussions that have taken place before within the international arena need to be open for the other one. Okay. So what the Africa Group is saying within the UN is that all discussions that have taken place need to essentially be opened up and reviewed at the UN, where decision-making can be taken in a truly democratic platform. The reason this is an important conversation is because the ITTF has a number of tax issues that it itself wants to explore. And essentially, if we create a mechanism where we are saying that the UN should only be dealing with things that are not touched elsewhere, what it does is excludes certain conversations that could be very important for us within the international tax agenda. So specifically, the ITTF is going to be looking at conversations on fossil fuel levy or carbon damages tax. It's going to be looking at windfall fossil fuel profits. It's going to be looking at fossil fuels, private air passenger levy, maritime fuel levy, as well as financial transactions tax. Particularly the last tax conversation is one that a number of developing countries have been pushing for, even at the UN. When you take a look at some of the documents that speak to what developing countries feel are priority areas they should be focusing on. And so if, for example, we proceed with this idea of non-duplication at the UN, a lot of what I've just mentioned now potentially would be discussions that are happening at the ITTF. The ITTF, unlike what's being proposed at the UN Tax Convention, is not fully inclusive, is not fully participatory, and in a sense is creating, therefore, another space where decisions are being made, where not all countries that are going to be affected by these decisions are present. And so one of the things that we are essentially indicating is that a lot of these discussions that are happening are, number one, removing resources from where we should be directing them. But secondly, as has been alluded to earlier, creating distractions from where we really should be placing all of our attention. And so I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the ITTF, but that's what's happening right now and why we should be wary of that, particularly being a platform where global conversations are being said to happen.
Thank you so much, Chennai. And I don't know why you are not clapping for my panel. Good, thank you. I think, Chennai, you remind us that it is important to think about which is the right platform on which all member states are involved and where we can achieve democracy as we, for example, have proper voting on international tax rules, where we can have more inclusivity, where everyone is involved. And I think you make an important point around this process that began last year with this at the same time as we were pushing for, another process at the UN, but not to steal any more time from the panelists. Grace, we want to come to you to think about, in all these conversations, are we missing anything? Are we grounding them on proper feminist perspectives? What is missing? Over to you, Grace.
Thank you, Francis. So I think first is to bring back into perspective what we've been talking about all through the conference, recognizing the fact that as African countries, most of our tax systems, all of them actually, are deeply rooted in neoliberal ideologies that continue to protect the interests of the global north and also protect largely the interests of the big corporates and the wealthy at the expense of citizens and the most marginalized groups in society. And we also recognize the fact that they remain largely extractive and allow for African countries to lose their taxing rights and create a lot of leakages through tax evasion, tax avoidance, all which erode the tax base. And most of the money that we're losing is to the more developed countries. And so quickly going into the UN Tax Convention, while we appreciate the fact that, yes, it is a huge step in terms of democratizing the tax system, ensuring that the voices of developing countries are heard, that African countries are at the table as well. It is important that we have a feminist lens to it, ensure that women who are usually disproportionately impacted, especially by the regressive tax systems, are put into consideration while this is being developed. And we recognize that previously we've seen countries making commitments under different conventions on human rights. We have the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, speaking towards gender, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, as well as the Beijing Declaration, all in which governments have committed to ensuring the existence of gender transformative tax systems. However, we see that very few countries, almost none, are actually adhering to these commitments and making sure that their tax systems are gender transformative and pay critical attention to the needs of women and girls. And what we see in the TORs that were recently shared is that they are largely gender blind. There's no mention of gender. There's no mention of women or girls or anything like that. And we feel the need to have language that speaks to that, speaks to calling countries to ensure that the tax systems they have in place are gender transformative and also broadly if I look at it broadly within the human rights lens, ensuring that countries are paying attention to the harm that they cause other countries. In this instance, I'm looking at the developed countries, the harm that they cause to other countries in instances where they have tax rules or tax laws that are taking away from them and are unfair. But also the fact that the UN the TORs that were put in place do not provide for accountability mechanisms, especially when it comes to countries fulfilling the terms that would have been set within the convention. And those are some of the things that we need to look out for. Otherwise, it will just be the same on and on conversations that we keep having in terms of putting in place the rightful policies to protect African countries or to fulfill basic human rights that are not adhered to. And what are some of the solutions and opportunities that we are looking at in terms of pushing this agenda forward? We have an ongoing process to review the Beijing platform and declaration for action, where we see, which we feel provides an opportunity for women's rights activists, feminist organizations, as well as civil society organizations to hold their governments accountable, as well as the UN, to ensure that we have these accountability mechanisms, as well as having gender and feminist alternatives reflected within the UN Tax Convention. As a continent, there's definitely a great need for us to have solidarity and join together to see that we are pushing for a convention that is gender transformative, that pays attention to our needs as African countries. Quickly going back to some of the things that we've previously looked at, like Ubuntu, that would bring all of us together and champion a convention that protects our that protects our interests, but also fronts the needs of African women and girls. And capacity strengthening is also very critical, as well as empowerment, not only for government and not only for government technocrats, but for political leaders as well, to appreciate the importance of feminist tax frameworks that would ensure that everyone everyone's needs are taken care of. And lastly, the need for an intersectional approach throughout the development of the UN Tax Convention. And in this, I mean the fact that we need to recognize that tax policies impact everyone different, looking at gender, race, class, all these need to be put into perspective and should be connected throughout the process of the UN Tax Convention. Thank you.
Thank you. I know part of the reason why you're clapping is that you know that now we are coming over to you and you have a chance to ask my panel some questions. Thank you, Grace, for reminding us that even as we deliver the reforms of the international financial architecture, we should not be distracted from the reality that we need to deliver gender transformative tax systems. We have 5 panelists and about 10 minutes remaining. Any quick questions? I see 15 hands. Good. I see 5 hands. So we'll start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And please, if you could also direct, we have Pooja online. So if you also want to direct your question to Pooja, please come in. Please come in. Technical team, if you could, the translation.
So I know that the power dynamics between the OECD countries and our blocks are very unfair, and that's why we need to have conversations at the UN. My question is, what can we do as civil society organizations to first call out these distractions, and second of all, how block them from going forward and from replacing the process that's going on in the United Nations? So thank you. Yeah, just.
Gabriel?
Yeah, I think mine is working. I would like to first to thank our your end there. Oh, now it's working. Okay. So I was just thanking our panelists for the wonderful insights they've shared. I have only 2 questions. The first one is for Shen. It's Shen, right? Okay. Shen. Yes, you said that the framework is not working. The G20 common framework is not working. So my question here is simple. What do we do? Do we reform it or dismantle it completely? Because if you're saying it's not working, perhaps it's working for the creditors. As you said, it's creditor-centric. It's not working for us, but it's working for them. So what do we do from there? And the second question is for Dr. Dereje. And it's regarding this process and all the distractions I had. I was really sad to hear yesterday that our negotiators are facing problems with resources, lack of resources. So where perhaps our priorities are not well defined in terms of supporting this movement. But my question is, what comes after the approval? I'm being optimistic after it passes. We have opposition now. Won't we have opposition in the implementation of that? And won't that stall even more the process? When as Africans we're going to start feeling the impacts of this movement that has been gaining momentum? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Fatea?
Yeah, this is working. So my question is about the narrative. the very dangerous thing that's happening when we talk about the OECD and the inclusive framework and how bad it is for African countries. They say, beware, if you turn your back to OECD, you will no longer receive foreign direct investment. If we are talking about illicit financial flows, they will say the problem is with your system. The problem is with terrorism, with corruption, with organized crime, and with the contraband. While we know and we are sure about that, and we have some facts, not enough data, but some facts that the major, huge part of illicit financial flows come from illicit resources, come from loopholes, comes from misinvoicing. So there is always the OECD and the Northern country narrative. They are always trying to turn it back on us. It's our problem, and we cannot run from their system. How we can reach the point when we shift that narrative, we change the ideas and show the world the other side of the story, the true side of the story.
Thank you, Fatea. I think I have two more hands. I see you, brother. Please come in.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde. Moi, j'ai deux remarques à faire par rapport au travail que les uns et les autres font, plus particulièrement la Commission de l'Union africaine. Moi, ma première remarque, c'est que depuis avant-hier, j'ai remarqué qu'il y a les États, donc il y a beaucoup de grands fonctionnaires qui sont représentés ici. Il y a aussi la société civile qui est là. Par contre, je n'ai pas vu les entrepreneurs africains, le secteur privé africain, n'est pas convié à ces travaux, ne participe pas en fait à ça, alors que c'est un des piliers aussi qui va nous permettre en fait de lutter contre, que ça soit la justice fiscale ou aussi les flux financiers illicites. On ne les a pas. Ce sont des gens qui ont des compétences qu'ils peuvent mettre à la disposition du continent africain pour participer à ce que j'appellerais en fait la guerre économique, parce que c'est une guerre économique. Les flux financiers illicites, la justice fiscale, l'évasion fiscale, tout ça, ça rentre dans le cadre d'un chemin global que certains experts appellent la guerre économique. Donc, nos entrepreneurs, le secteur privé africain peut aider aussi à améliorer la situation en Afrique. Ça, c'est ma première critique. J'espère que pour les sessions prochaines, on va inviter le secteur privé africain. Donc, la deuxième critique concerne en fait le fonctionnement des paradis fiscaux. Depuis 3 jours, aucun des experts, en tout cas, c'est mon constat, ne nous a expliqué concrètement comment fonctionne un paradis fiscal. Quels sont les mécanismes en jeu? Qui sont les acteurs? Comment est-ce que le politicien africain qui est corrompu, à qui on propose, je ne sais pas, 10 millions d'euros, qui ne peut pas le déclarer légalement, comment est-ce qu'il arrive, à travers des mécanismes financiers, à faire sortir l'argent du continent, et comment est-ce que cet argent-là va en fait disparaître dans les méandres des paradis fiscaux. Voilà, donc ce serait bien qu'on nous explique en fait les mécanismes par lesquels cet argent-là quitte concrètement le continent, va ailleurs, généralement en Europe et en Asie, et comment est-ce que cet argent disparaît complètement des radars. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much. We gave you an extra minute or so to also be very accommodative in the diversity of the language. Did I miss another hand? Yes, Mr. Daniel. And I think that will be the last question, sorry, because of time.
Thank you. Mine is more of a contribution than a question. And I think that one of the things that we need to do in terms of the convention to avoid these disparities, and I mentioned it on day one, is to really get our principals to understand what is happening in New York. When we understand it, then because climate is a part of what we are looking at as part of the framework convention. So then we bring which is what we are trying to bring everything together on one table for one discussion. So we need to look at that process of getting, there's supposed to be an African tax strategy. How does this strategy fit into the convention we are looking at? Bring everything onto the table, have that, take away that disconnect, then we'll stop having these disparities. Another thing is the gender issue. We have enough problems on our table in terms of what we are negotiating before bringing in the gender issue at that level. I believe the gender issue should be at the national level. We are bringing in money into our domestic systems. Then we tackle this issue there because we have specific issues for each country. So that in terms of the sovereignty of the tax system, domestic tax systems, we can use it to address these things. Internationally, we have different things. So then you have varying things and even bringing it onto the convention. So I think those are the things we need to look at in terms of moving forward with the convention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. Father Chikoya, I don't want to miss you. Please come in.
Almost given up. Thank you very much. I'm Father Chikoya from the Council of Churches in Zambia. I think just looking at the, first and foremost, kudos to the panelists and all the other presenters. It's a very transformative kind of first time interaction with this topic for me. And we're requested to celebrate the debt restructuring in Zambia. And what I hear is a wake-up call that actually we are transferring problems and not really solving the problem. And so looking at these dynamics, why is it that our African leaders seem to be so fascinated with these forums such as the G20 and the OECD? They cause the problem. I agree we have challenges of corruption and etc. But in the first place, I think the narrative also, how is that counter narrative to begin to deal with this issue in the sense that you caused the problem in the first place? You are accommodating the rooted funds. And so how does the one who receives the, these rooted funds become a saint? And those from the so-called corrupt countries then are given these laborious kind of conditionalities. And it is, I think the narrative has to change. And so I'm interested in knowing how best we can ensure that there's this counter push to change the narrative and actually say there are actually two, I almost said devils, but we must call it as it is. And I sincerely feel we are baptizing these issues with a nice name, illicit financial flows, etc. These are crimes against humanity. Would that be too radical to call them by that name? Because of the lack of resources, people die and services are not available. And so while others use guns, others use financial systems to eliminate and disadvantage others.
Thank you so much. I want us to come back to the panel in the few minutes remaining. And I know that each of you picked a question. And I will also request that Chennai, you also speak about the African Parliament. But I want to go to Pooja. Pooja, if you could come in and because you're coming in fast, you have an open plate, so you can choose which question to answer. And then I think the rest of the panel will take the cue from you. Please come in about a minute or so.
Okay, I will do my best to stay within the minute.
Sound,
can
just
you
hold
hear
a
me?
minute. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, working.
Okay, now you're hearing. Okay. I couldn't hear all the questions, so I will address what I could pick up on. I think one question I heard was, what is the alternative to the G20 Common Framework on Debt? Because of the upcoming 4th FFD conference, and this is something that's actually quite a big priority on addressing sovereign debt in the negotiations. I just wanted to flag that G77 in 2015 had actually tabled a General Assembly resolution similar to what Africa Group did on tax. G77 in China in 2015 tabled a General Assembly resolution to establish a legal framework on debt within the United Nations. It was blocked by the other side and so didn't go very far. And of course, a lot has changed since 2015 in terms of the debt landscape and the complications with private creditors and so on. So it really is, I think, time to think about a more kind of systematic overhaul of the sovereign debt architecture, the importance of debtors being at the table. So that's something that's a big priority. Sorry, I don't know if there was any question specifically addressed to me, but I couldn't hear very well because of the technical challenge. But if you can flag it, I can get to it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pooja. Grace.
I think, so I think just one comment on what came from Daniel in terms of why we need to have gender factored in right from the international level. The fact that we've had commitments made on the need for gender transformative tax systems made within different international human rights frameworks, like I'd mentioned earlier, and they've not been domesticated at the national level simply because we do not really have accountability mechanisms at times that hold governments to respond and make sure they are incorporated. Means that the convention gives us an opportunity to see that it is reflected and that we have these systems in place right from the national level, but also that the fact that international tax treaties, for instance, at that point would also then pay attention to that. The other one that I could speak to would probably be around why African leaders are probably fascinated by the OECD and the G20. And I think it also still goes back to our colonial roots and the fact that some of the financial instruments or the financial laws that we have in place were developed without us, and the fact that we are indebted to them and that they have taken power and they are the ones giving us the money means that African countries then tend to bend their knees at whatever is said by these entities. And I think it's for us to take the power back, and we take the power back by strengthening our domestic revenue mobilization systems, because tax is the most sustainable source of financing. And if we have our own revenue and we decide what we do with it, it means that we do not have to rely on them in terms of financing, and they would then not have to wholly set the rules without us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Grace. Chennai, please come in.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I'll be quick. So I think I'll speak to two, both of which I think were raised by Daniel. So I think the first is that I completely agree. I think ideally what we want to do is have the UN be where decision-making on all tax conversations take place. And so this includes some of the conversations that I mentioned are taking place at the ITTF, as well as some of these other conversations that are now happening at, for example, in the G20 on the global wealth tax. I think that the point of what we're trying to do here is create a platform where decision-making on any international tax rule, et cetera, take place at the UN. And I think ultimately that should be the outcome of what we're trying to push. I think with regards to the gender question, one of the points that was made in the Secretary General's report that was released following Resolution 78-230 was the fact that by housing this conversation on international tax at the UN, it allows us to create these linkages to all of the different SDGs, right? Because this is why we're talking about tax, ideally to finance all of these SDGs. And I think when thinking about the SDGs, the gender aspect is a very important component we need to be thinking about. And I think to Grace's point, if we can make that front and center right from the beginning, it allows us to incorporate some of that thinking, even as we're thinking about international tax. But I think there is value in creating that linkage at the UN because, for example, at the OECD, there isn't that mandate to include some of these other areas that are important. So maybe just to add to what Grace has said.
Yeah, Chennai, if you could comment on the involvement of parliamentarians.
Yes, so I think on parliamentarians, they are an incredibly important stakeholder within this conversation on tax. And I think some of you may have heard yesterday, as TGNA, we have this continental platform where we're working with MPs to build their knowledge on tax and the issue of illicit financial flows. And I think we found that often by supporting an MP to just ask the right question in their National Assembly can create change, right? Particularly with regards to some of the reform that we want to see. So definitely MPs are an important stakeholder and seeing how we can link them, I think to PAP within the AU is something that we've been exploring, but definitely not a constituency we want to ignore because at the end of the day, the ratification of all of these processes happens as a result of them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dereje?
I will focus on the question you asked about what as civil society, what should we do? The first one, I think, is to expose the hypocrisy of the other side. We have as Global Alliance for Tax Justice, we have been doing 2 campaigns, promoting the UN Tax Convention thing and exposing what the OECD is doing against the interest of developing countries. We had very successful conferences. A, say no to the tax deal of the rich. B, build your houses on your own pillars instead of the OECD 2 pillars. See, and then don't sign blank checks and cede your taxing rights. These were our slogans. And there is a lot of hypocrisy in it. If you look at the European Union, figuring here prominently, one of the major blockers in the UN process. Let me invite you to listen to the UN TV and UN TV recordings and see for yourself that at every juncture there is an obstacle put by OECD countries. And actually the European Union position is much worse than the position of individual members. So there are such hypocrisies we have to expose. It is about our rights. We are not talking about, it is paternalistic and condescending to tell us what is good for us. When Africans are negotiating united together to tell them, no, come to us, we are doing it for you here. This is itself condescending, that is. The second one for me, very important, is to insist that we continue on the chartered path. We have to put our governments under pressure. We have to put Pan-African institutions under pressure to keep the unity, to speak together as they have done up to now. If there is that is actually what is maybe happening behind the scenes. Because the United Front of Africa is the motor of the advance at the United Nations. It is the unity of the African group which has enabled it to muster support of G77 countries and to get majority every time they put something forward. That is what OECD countries are worried about. That is what they are trying to divide. So we have to keep them united on this agenda. So let us not be distracted. We have done much step forward, but the future belongs on maintaining this unity. So the 2 things: exposing the hypocrites, and then advancing the African unity along what's happening up to now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dereje. We are almost out of time, but Shem, have the final one.
Okay, thank you. I'll take 1 minute to save on time. Just to answer the question that my colleague asked regarding the G20, whether it need to be removed in totality or we need to reform it. Like Chanaya said, we have to make sure that we work under the UN. And I think it's very important that we take into consideration, for example, if you look at what happened in Zambia, it took almost 3 years for the process to go through. And look at what happened in Ghana. It's back and forth. And I think that is very important to look on to, because when you look at the resolutions that were made under the G77 in Kampala early this year, one of the resolution and the emphasis that were made was, why don't we go back to the UN legal framework on debt? And you will realize, like Dr. Dereja said, most of the countries that made sure that that process did not go through, that was brought forward in 2014, is countries under the OECD. I mean, they knew the reason, not because the process was bad, but because they wanted to maintain the status quo. So it's very important that the process must be friendly even to the debtors, as the creditors are also looking on to the best way to recover some of their debts. So I think it's very important that we work under the UN common framework, if I have to call it that way, not in a way that it is party which is going to give, having the interest of few individuals while leaving most of the countries out. I think it's very important that as we champion for the Africa Union joining G20, there is a need to do a deep dive and look onto what is in the plate that we are going to come out with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shem. I think my panel deserves a round of applause. As well as you, give yourselves a clap for actually choosing to come to this panel, and for the technical team for saying recording stopped. Yeah, thank you. And we move on to the next panel. Thank you.
I go there. I think it's not working. It's, now it works. Hello, everyone. We are almost 1 hour before the lunch break, and I know that most of us are feeling a bit tired. So thank you for staying with us in this session. Our side event is titled "Navigating the Challenges of Domestic Resources Mobilization in Africa and its Debt Management Implications." I am honored to have with me today distinguished speakers. First of all, Mr. Alan Mukungu, who is Economic Affairs Officer, Macroeconomics and Governance Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Welcome. And we have also with us Mr. Direji Aliman Nehu, Executive Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. We have with us from Afrodad, Diana Mushogi. And finally, from Youth Tax Justice Network, Mr. John Kafuku. Welcome all. So because now we are limited with time, we'll have 1 hour for our session, and we will try to ask the main question of our event today. I will start with Mr. Allen, and we'll give everyone 5 minutes, and we'll take the floor. Give the floor to our participants to join us for the discussion. So my first question is, what will the UN tax reform look like, and how will it impact the fight against IFFS in Africa? And now I remember the last conclusion from our colleague Shem, the last panel was working more around the UN tax convention and also that legal framework. So how is your vision regarding the tax UN tax reform?
Thank you very much, Imen. And I'm glad to see the congregation again. Unfortunately, we have been here together and we have been talking this UN tax convention to death, it seems. But I think, let me try to take a very different approach. Why are we having the UN tax convention discussion? Why is it so important that it has occupied us so much? One is that the current rules, international tax rules that are governing us in the world today were formed sometimes before even other countries were formed, became independent. We never participated in bringing them together. There have been tweaks in that original system, but we still do not participate in shaping the norms of how the international tax cooperation is governed. So currently, there are two main ways that we do this. One, there is the UN committee of experts, which is looking at tax issues and trying to address those issues from the perspective of less developed countries. But this is a committee that is comprised of 25 experts who are nominated by countries, all right? But they don't represent the countries. So they don't have that mandate to speak on a country basis as a sovereign nation expressing an opinion. On the other hand, we have a 60-plus-year-old OECD platform that has got a membership and therefore serves that membership. It has got its own rules that guide and affect the members, and has been for these 60 years trying to make the rules for the world on international tax cooperation. And the dissatisfaction with those rules has meant that around the world, we have been asking for a review of those rules. And there have been bits and pieces that have been addressed. You know very well that now we have the so-called Global Forum, and there's an inclusive framework for it. That was an attempt to try and bring in the other countries into the benefiting from the framework that the OECD has established. But I think one of the complaints is that the discussions at the OECD have not been inclusive enough for other countries. And now countries are saying, no, we want to see that all countries, whether they are small or big, participate in setting the rules of international tax cooperation. And this is where we're coming from. When you start asking me how the UN tax reform is going to look like, some of the things that's going to take into consideration is how do countries participate in the decision making? Is it that they will have a voice? Is it that there will be a tokenistic presence? Or is it that their voice will actually have some bite in terms of shaping the rules that are made? So the UN Tax Convention is being designed, and we have an opportunity to do that now. And the premise is that we all participate in setting out the terms of reference that is going then to form the conference of parties that is going to be presiding over these processes. So right now, some of the things that they are looking at are the decision-making processes we have been uncomfortable with. Should it be based on consensus? And we know very well that at the OECD, because the OECD system is based on consensus, just one country, let us say they have 38 countries, but if one country objects to the discussion that has been reached and agreed upon by others, then that stalls that discussion and you can't conclude that, and they have to go back and forth. It delays things and that kind of thing. Now, we have argued that we need to bring it to the UN. One, because most of the countries aren't members of OECD. When it comes to accountability, OECD is accountable to its members, not to the inclusive framework members who have signed up for that, which apparently include not only member states, that is sovereign countries, but also includes jurisdictions such as the tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions, which could be part of or with allegiances to some of the OECD member countries. So there are mechanisms there which may inhibit progressive discussion of issues of especially countries from the global south. So we are hoping that the UN system is going to address this. The other one has been the fact that although countries are independent, but the historical legacies of the current system means that some of the things that have been required of countries do not really apply, i.e., for instance, you have under the OECD, I think there has been the automatic exchange of information. Before then, there was the exchange of information. And one of the requirements under this was that if they ask for information, you needed to provide that information. If you ask for that information, they need to provide that information. But sometimes they ask for information that countries, especially from the global south, do not have the wherewithal to collect that information. And then they have what they call reciprocity. So if you can't provide that information, next time you're asking for information, we also will not be able to give you the information because you didn't cooperate with us. So we're trying to see that when we go to the UN system, what we are looking at is If we say there should be exchange of information, that should be unconditional. There are no conditions attached to this. If you have the information or you're required to give the information, please do give the information. So this is the kind of system that we are looking for. Now, in terms of illicit financial flows, there are a number of things that are going on. There's been talk about beneficial registers and beneficial ownership registers. And these have been implemented to certain extents. But now access to these registers has also been a problem. So if you're talking about combating IFFs and you think that beneficial ownership registers are key, then one, it is good, but if you do not have access to them, then it's not that good. So we are thinking that when we bring these things to the UN platform, these are some of the things that the UN discussions might have to ask member states to have to avail. I know I can talk about these things until tomorrow, but I think let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But maybe we'll come back to these points when we come to the discussion. Okay. So we go to you, DJ, and we will talk more about the UN tax convention at national level, and how do you see this convention applied, and what should be the member state of the African Union? What should be the role of our countries at national level?
Maybe this is okay. Yes, two things really. The first is the UN Tax Convention, Framework Tax Convention, is about international tax cooperation. It is about how the international member states should deal with cross-border trade, cross-border investment, all such things. So it is about the relationship. So it does not immediately, it's not about domestic tax policy. Domestic tax policy will remain a sovereign nation-state level work. But it does, on two things they are related. The first one is the principles enshrined in the UN Tax Convention will necessarily impact on domestic discussions, it gives the principal foundation, like other UN-based declarations, but it has to be domesticated and introduced into. But immediate impact of the UN Tax Convention is not on domestic taxation, but it has a lot of impact on domestic taxation on many different levels. The first one, just imagine the principle underlying the UN Tax Convention will be the tax policy and practice of a country should not undermine the tax revenue of another country. It is something that in principle makes tax dodging impossible, because it is by stealing other countries' tax revenue that others are getting rich. If Switzerland is attracting all these commodity producers from around the world without producing its own commodities, it is hijacking resources from other countries. So it is a matter of putting an end to such transfer of profits to other jurisdictions. So in that sense, but what happens because of this practice up to now? Countries have almost permanently reducing corporate income tax and going to VATs. It is in Europe the same case, it is everywhere. So the fact that multinationals are not paying their taxes has made it easy for countries to minimize taxes on them and maximize taxes on the poor. That is what's happening in Europe. I can go into detail and show you that the corporate income tax has been going down in Europe, and and the VAT, which is actually consumption tax, which affects the less well-to-do, is on the increase. The other one is it makes it possible also to reduce the race to the bottom competition between countries to attract. So by doing such things, it impacts on international, domestic. But the other thing is, it does not. It gives us a framework to fight for progressive taxation systems in our countries, which is not the case up to now. And here, there is no capacity building we should expect from Europe. It is as aggressive as it is here as well. Corporations are not paying taxes, due taxes in Europe as well. Countries are not, those who are defending the OECD are not defending their country's interests. They are defending the interests of their multinational companies. You know what an American president at one point said, what is good for General Motors is good for America. That is their principle, but it is not true. It is not true. Poverty, inequality is increasing in Europe because it is based on this principle of taxing the corporations less and taxing the less well-to-do more. So because of that, it is a universal struggle to make tax systems progressive in each country. But the UN Tax Convention had the role of reducing the impact of tax competition on domestic tax policy, reducing the tax policy in the sense that because you cannot tax multinationals, they shift their profits, you fall on taxing the because you are not taxing multinationals because they are shifting their profits, you go to the creditors and increase your debt. So that is why the UN Tax Convention gives us the framework in which improves the tax cooperation between countries to make tax, at least if not crime, at least to make it not lucrative. Tax dodging has become lucrative now. There are countries getting rich because of that. So that is the prevention of it will influence the domestic policy. It is in that sense that it is related, and then the underlying principles like it has, taxes must serve enable countries to fulfill their obligations. Their obligations to defend human rights, for gender equality on that. These are all dependent on revenues the government can get. So in that sense, it influences domestic policy as well. Thank you.
This is very helpful. And now we go to Diana, and Diana will tell us more about the role of civil society organizations in Africa to advocate or to support this UN tax convention.
Thank you very much. And I'll just pick up from Dereje, what he mentioned in the last session, especially on civil society organizations calling out hypocrisy. But just to add to that, it's very important that civil society organizations continue in the collaborative advocacy efforts that we've seen, especially in the negotiations of the UN Tax Convention. We've seen very great leadership in terms of Tax Justice Network, bringing organizations from the African continent together to be able to participate in the negotiation processes at the UN. We've also seen leadership from organizations like Eurodad and the Global Tax Justice Alliance Network, bringing civil society organizations from Europe and Latin America and Asia to be able to give their voices towards the process. So that collective advocacy and collective voice should continue within civil society organizations. Another very important thing is to ensure that we engage the media, and this is both social media, print media, and the media at large, being able to explain to them the process so that they can be able to bring this information down to the people, because we know the people need to understand and to engage in the process, and the media
is one of our key allies in ensuring that the information on the UN Tax Convention is actually shared with the people on the ground. Of course, the most important constituents is the citizens, and we've already talked about how regressive tax policies and measures like austerity actually impact on the vulnerable, and these are women, girls, and even the youth. So ensuring that citizens are able to understand how these regressive tax measures and austerity measures that are put in place by institutions like the IMF actually impact on their livelihoods. And of course, we've had over and over again the example of what is happening in Kenya, where we see the young people actually going and protesting against regressive taxation measures, which actually impacts on their livelihoods. So engaging citizens is very important, and ensuring that this information is broken down to a level where they are able to understand. And we can do this by having very creative infographics where we can put information on illicit financial flows and how it impacts on social services, putting information on how austerity actually impacts on issues like cuts on healthcare, cuts on education, which actually impacts on people. So putting this information in creative ways is able to get the information to the people, then they are able to engage. And this is part of civic education, which we can be able to do in collaboration with national governments and also with parliamentarians. It's very important to get parliamentarians involved, ensuring that they are able to participate, engage in the discussions that we hold with citizens on the ground, and also at the same time explaining to them why the issue is important and why they should participate at our national levels. So very quickly, just as a solution, we would urge governments to be able to work with national legislatures to ensure that they strengthen the national legal frameworks to ensure transparency and accountability. And this has been mentioned again during this meeting. And of course, ensuring that citizens, the power goes back to the citizens so that they can be able to hold their governments accountable with regards to their actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. Now we'll go to finish our first round of interventions, and we go to June to talk about youth and talking about this Africa tax agenda and UN tax convention reform, tax reform as a solution to illicit financial flows. So can you talk more about this impact on youth and how this UN tax reform will benefit to youth, as the majority of the population of Africa are from youth population?
Thank you very much. I'll try to narrow it down to the education sector, since the African Union is celebrating a year of education, IFFs abroad. So I've just something from the Transforming Education Financing Report. It says that about 18 million young girls are dropping out of school because they don't have finances. And the report also says that Africa is losing about 29 billion annually in illicit financial flows, which is money which could be used to take those girls back to school. And it also says that most African countries are spending about 12% of their budgets on debt payments. This is money which could also be allocated to the debt sector and, to ensure these young people go back to school. But and I think that paints a general picture on the impact of the IFFs on young people. We are being denied the right to education and other basic needs. But since we are pressed for time, I'll talk about the UN Tax Convention and what we as young people can be able to do to have some form of reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree with me that we are not in this position where we are now by mistake. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that 18 million girls are not going to school because they don't have finances. It's not by accident that global rulemaking is in the hands of a few countries. And neither is it by accident that many young people are unemployed and languishing on the streets, engaging in criminalities. I don't think it's by accident. I think there's a force behind it. There are people who have invested a lot in terms of technical expertise, in terms of human resource, in terms of finances. They have invested a lot to keep us where we are here. So we have to fight for this. We really have to fight for it. I feel that there is no easier way to this. There is no easier way. I think that what has been happening, for example, in Kenya, what has been happening in West Africa, just shows us what we have to do. It's if someone has invested this much resources, this much, you don't expect them to give you what you're demanding for on a silver platter. You don't expect to go and sit them on have a cup of tea and they give you whatever you're asking for. You know, they have invested a lot right from the colonial era. So we have to fight for this. There's no easier way. I know I wouldn't support violence, of course, but we have to fight for whatever we want. So I think there is just no easier way. As young people, we have to unite, have movements, put our governments on pressure. We have to ask the questions. We have to, our leaders are our servants. We have to ask them the tough questions. They have to answer. They have to account to us. You know, we cannot let them do whatever they want and then get away with it. We have to put them on pressure. Thank you.
Inside. Now we'll go to the discussion. So I will take note of your names. Who wants to start? Yes, you and you and you. We start with you. I'm sorry, I don't know the names, so we go with you first, then Madame. Yes. Okay, I know.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so interested, in fact, not really.
Sorry for interrupting.
Okay.
It's very useful if you tell us your name
Okay.
and if your question is addressed directly to one of them or not.
Okay. My name's Samuel Stanley Mkwatwa, and I come from Police Forum, Tanzania. I'm just interested to, it's not like I want to question directly to one of the panelists, but it's rather like a discussion when maybe they respond. The issue of the political will from our government as far as resource mobilization is concerned. Because what we see now, and we're talking about this UN convention and everything, it calls for Africa to be together. And one of the discussions that we have been having is like, we should make sure that African countries go for unilateral agreements rather than bilateral. But we see most of African countries going to or love these bilateral agreements. So they are not even looking on what to do for internal or domestic resource mobilization. They will rather think of going and borrowing. Taking my example, the country that I'm coming from, we see a lot of times, our president going and then signing this bilateral agreement. So what is it should be done, for example, at least to call the political will from these politicians, the so-called presidents and whatever, to make sure that what we want as African when we are going to this UN process as far as domestic resource mobilization concerned, come together and then agree on what we say. So otherwise I see a kind of confusion, like we'll be just going around like what the lady said, Thank you.
Good morning and thank you for the opportunity. My name is Uhuru Dempers. I'm from the Council of Churches in Namibia. Just two issues. One, there was a recommendation in an earlier session about the need for African governments, probably together with civil society, to come up with a tax strategy of the continent, which will clarify what is happening and hopefully state that we want to invest more resources and focus into what's happening in New York at the UN, and that we want to spend less effort on the OECD and other processes which are not legitimate in terms of our view. What does this panel think about this, and could this become hopefully part of the outcomes of this conference as a concrete recommendation that we recommend that African ministers of finance together with civil society come up with a tech strategy to consolidate our position during the negotiations? Secondly, I wanted to ask the youth representative, how do we as civil society assist our young people to institutionalize this energy? There has been a lot of these movements on the continent, sporadic on the social media and so on, and they have made significant impacts. And then afterwards, this movement sort of dies down and so on. So how do we help the youth and other social movements to really institutionalize so that we can sustain this revolution and this struggle over a long period of time? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Lady. Yes.
Much. Yolanda Sabino here from Mozambique. First of all, I would like to congratulate the panel members for their presentations. And related to the topic, I would like to comment, especially on the challenges that we might face as Africans, especially in revenue mobilization. The first, from what we have heard since the first day of the conference, it seems that we have all find out that data is crucial. It's crucial for IAFs, for debt control, even to improve the domestic revenue. From this, it was also said that it's necessary to have communicability of the systems, the interoperability of the systems. But what I have realized is that we have two broad groups of data. The first one, if we want to have the IAFs and beneficial owners, there are also aspects that need to be taken into consideration in a broader base for governments. For example, different countries in Africa, they do have license being attributed by different ministries. Security Ministry is attributing, the Ministry of Commerce is attributing certain type of data. And if you go for transit, maritime, they also attribute, yes. There is no harmonization of data not being centralized. If you only work with the Ministry of Commerce, you might leave out the risky areas of IAFs like tourism, security, including the transit. The last thing that I wanted to talk of is related to debt management. This is something that in most of African countries are failing to control debt management. There are no systems. We talk of systems for tax collection. We talk of systems for auditing, but we very rarely talk of debt collection systems. And we are losing a lot of money because in countries, for example, I'm from Mozambique, if there's 10 years and the taxpayer is not located, that millions of money, it has to go to the bin. And there are lots of foreign companies that come, they work, and then they are not found, and we find out having lots of money in debt department. So I think there is a need also to have an automated debt management control in tax authorities. Thank you.
Very much. Do we have another? Yes, please. So please put on your. Commencez, oui.
Bonjour aux panélistes. Et je remercie aussi l'ensemble des acteurs qui se sont passés devant nous pour exposer.
Si vous pouvez vous approcher du micro.
Bon, là c'est bon? Oui, d'accord. Donc je remercie les panélistes. Moi c'est Sal, je suis de la Mauritanie. Donc je remercie les panélistes qui sont succédés depuis avant-hier devant nous. Ça fait vraiment un plaisir pour nous d'écouter les gens et de connaître exactement les flux financiers. J'ai en fait 2 à 3 questions en fait. Ma première question est adressée d'abord aux responsables des Nations Unies chargés des réformes financières ou des conventions en fait. Il a parlé des conventions qui datent même des... Vous m'entendez? Pour la traduction, ça passe? Je pense qu'ils ont un problème de translation, hein?
It's not working. Yeah.
Not working?
Not
Yeah.
working.
It's okay? Ça passe?
Can we try now? Is it working?
Please change, take this, hein? Vous pouvez lui donner ça, hein? Ça marche.
Ah, they're not working, all of them. So maybe he asked his question. I will do the translation. So I'm taking your job. So. Okay.
Oui, en fait, ma première question est adressée à lui en tant que responsable des institutions au niveau des Nations Unies, donc concernant les réformes, les conventions et les réformes fiscales. Parce qu'il a parlé des conventions qui datent même avant même des années de l'indépendance de certains pays africains, en fait. Mais pourquoi ces pays qui n'ont même pas été, c'est-à-dire des initiateurs de ces conventions y adhèrent? Ça, c'est ma première question d'abord adressée à lui, en tant que
Vous pouvez
responsable.
répéter, je n'ai pas.
Ouais, en fait, il a parlé des conventions concernant les règles de l'OCDE, des systèmes des Nations Unies concernant les taxes et ainsi de suite, que ces textes datent même des années d'avant l'indépendance donc de certains pays, donc voilà, ce qui était sous la colonisation. Donc ces textes-là, pourquoi des textes acquis des pays africains qui n'ont pas été d'abord initiateurs de ces textes qui adorent à ces conventions? Pourquoi d'abord suivre des choses à qui qu'on n'a même pas été donc voilà présent? Ça, c'est ma première question. Et ma deuxième question est adressée à la société civile. J'ai beaucoup suivi avec beaucoup d'attention. Ces interventions sont vraiment pertinentes. Par rapport à l'équilibrisme de ce qui se passe actuellement, c'est-à-dire entre ce qu'on appelle nous, les Africains, on a tapé toutes les portes pendant des années pour y accéder, non, pour avoir au moins un siège au niveau du G20. On a eu un siège. Maintenant, c'est quoi? Maintenant, il y a aussi les BRICS. Tout le monde y converge vers les BRICS parce qu'il y a plus d'argent, en fait. Quel est le rôle d'équilibrisme en tant que des responsables de la société civile pour alerter la société, les pays africains par rapport à ces G20, donc l'Occident d'une manière générale, et les BRICS en tant que les fournisseurs et les détenteurs de capitaux? Ça, c'est ma question adressée aussi aux responsables de la société civile.
Now the translation is working, so if you try.
Ma deuxième question, c'est aussi, ma troisième question plutôt, est adressée aussi aux responsables de la jeunesse. En tant que responsable de la jeunesse, est-ce que la jeunesse, c'est-à-dire cette jeunesse dont nous parlons tous les jours, la jeunesse représente 60 à 70% de la population mondiale en Afrique. Donc, c'est le continent qui quand même, qui constitue, c'est un avantage aussi, c'est une bombe à retardement en tant que jeunesse. Donc, une jeunesse qui n'est pas formée, une jeunesse qui n'est pas initiée au TIC et à l'IA, l'intelligence artificielle, est-ce que cette jeunesse vraiment représentée, cette jeunesse peut être demain être un facteur de développement et non de charge pour les pays africains? Donc voilà, je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question? And if not, I will give the, yes.
Can you, so I just wanted to direct my question straight to the representative for the youth. Just realizing now there's a Youth for Tax Justice Network, and mine is simple. What role did you play when the Kenyan youth were protesting against the finance bill and everything that followed afterwards? Thank you.
I think if we don't have another question, we have already 15 minutes to answer the questions. And for the question in France, it was for you, Alan, and it was about the convention of African countries even before the independence, and why we don't go back to this legal text, and we work on that. Did I translate well your thoughts? Okay. And the second question in French here was about CSOs and their roles, and also about the BRICS, if I get it well. So I will just summarize the majority of questions we had. We had a question about this UN tax reform and the political will in Africa. Also about having a debt strategy with CSOs within Africa, and it should be like the outcome of this conference maybe, and also about the youth in Africa, and how we can make youth engage more, or like use this energy. And our colleague here used the word institutionalize the role of youth. And also we had this intervention about having this I wrote it in French, so she was talking in English. I don't. So about this income mobilization and the IFF and the debt in Africa. I hope I summarized most of the questions, and I will start with you, Alan, if it's okay, and we'll follow the same order. You have 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes.
I think I can't agree more with the person who talked about the political will. I think he was somewhere there. The political will is important. And when we look at the UN Tax Convention and that process, how it has come, it has reached crossroads where we need to question the political will of African countries, how committed they are to this particular process. And we need to see that demonstration in how they are coming behind to provide country support to the people in New York who are representing Africa in the process of farming up the TORs. For instance, there is the issue, I think, which has been discussed in this conference. I think it was raised by one of the representatives from New York, who are saying that they need adequate financing to bring people from the countries to participate in the processes. Because what happens is you go to the meeting, and one country such as the US will bring about 250 people to speak. And then you have African countries, 54 of them may have very few people to do the speaking. And they also say that some of the tactics required repetition, reaffirmation. If someone says something, don't say that, tick a box that it has been said, and you don't speak up as well. You should also speak up. That means that we need to put resources behind this process. We should not expect anyone else to try and resource that process. So the political will comes in here in committing the resources that are required to get us there, if we really believe that what we are doing is correct. I think yesterday or 2 days ago, we had the African Development Bank representative here. He was talking about the process in Guinea, where they had to put resources, a lot of resources, but then the payoff was high. And I think the Guinean government was feeling good that although they used quite a lot of money, in the end, the benefits justified that investment. And I think here, it's also important for us, different countries, to look at this process from a very logical way. What is it that we are aiming this UN Tax Convention to do what will be the returns to the little money that we are thinking of investing in making us participate effectively in setting the norms at the UN. So that is to do with the political will issue. The second one, I think there was someone who talked about an African strategy for taxation. And I think I just want to remind that I think whether it was yesterday, but in the past, whether it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, the commissioner, the director from AUC spoke about a strategy that the AUC is coming up with. And as far as we are concerned, we are feeding into that strategy, and it will be an African strategy on tax. They already have an STC subcommittee, which is looking at tax and IFFs. So this is going to take into consideration those things. When the STC meets, that tax strategy is going to be presented, and there will be an opportunity for member states to feed into that. And then, of course, after doing that, agreeing at that level, it can then be cascaded down to member states to see how it informs each member state's own tax strategy.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we go to you now.
Okay, I will talk to two questions. One is the international tax rulemaking. The first, which is now in practice, was enacted by the League of Nations before in the beginning of the 1920s. It has outlived everything else. Countries which were not existing there are existing. The global economy has changed. The way companies organize their business have changed. You know, when we started the campaign, we were doing some research which shows, for example, that Sab Miller International paid less taxes on its investment in Ghana than a street beer vendor in Accra. This is how they are organized. I cannot go into the detail, but how business is organized is such that they pay taxes where they pay taxes. They put their profits in countries where they don't need to pay taxes, and that is what is called profit shifting. So this mechanism has to change corresponding to the current reality of sovereign states, which are together at the UN, and then also how companies are organized, digitalization of the economy. You don't need physical presence to sell your products in different countries. So taking this geopolitical and economic change, the rules also have to change. That is why the UN, as a universal membership organization, has the legitimacy to do that. The second one, my biggest worry is becoming a nightmare. The African Union is co-opted into the G20, which is a bad news for Africa. Because why was the G20 created? It was created to take away decision-making from the UN. Those countries who are blocking in the UN system, they wanted to take their decisions without being disturbed by the noise of poor countries. So they created a parallel structure without any legitimacy so that decision-taking and decision-making does not happen at the UN. And now, it was a G7 thing. They said, let's co-opt some countries which are coming closer to us. They co-opted some other countries, and then now the African Union also went in. Just a simple question. If, for example, there was a debt restructuring process at the UN, it was vetoed by OECD countries. And then how can it be possible that you block a solution at the UN and try to do the to bring a solution at a forum which is you are dominating? So the thing is, there is no the real power in the G20 does not belong to those members. It is a subsidiary organization of the G7. By taking decision-making discussion from the UN away, you are weakening the voice of Africa, which is stronger at the UN than it will be at the G20 level. My question is, if it is looking for a solution globally, why don't they do it in the UN? Why, is it a democratic principle to run away from democracy? This is the question we have to ask ourselves. Who is blocking any reform in the world at the UN? Those countries who block it there try to bring it elsewhere where they have their say, where you are not equal. There is an Amharic proverb which says, if you want to cheat a chicken, you fail it with a rope, like an ox, so that it feels strong. So that is what is happening really. And Africa is not going. The thing is, it is either blocking a process at the UN, the purpose of the G7, or it is dominating the solution making. If it is something in the interest of Africa, there is an organization with universal membership, which is called the United Nations. The agenda is the same. There is no possibility that you will make it work elsewhere as where it is at its legitimate place. So I think that the attention of Africa should not be distracted by this G20 humbug. It is better to refocus our energies and work with with global South countries to change the structures there. The G20 has no legitimacy, has no mandate from whoever to solve anything. And if it is only them who block, why don't they come back to the UN and help us achieve this situation within the UN framework? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. And there, we have 5 minutes. We'll split between Diana and John. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Reggie. This is very.
I'll make it very fast. So the lady from Mozambique who talked about debt, just something that we are pushing for as AfroDad is for national governments to have an independent debt management office, which will cater for what you talked about in terms of systems. So having all the data being collated in one place. And then just finally on CSO role, we said about continued advocacy, having a united voice, and ensuring that we keep to monitor situations that are going on and engaging in the process. Over to you, John.
Well, thank you very much. About political will, I do agree, but my question is, how do we cultivate it? I mean, the convention will pass, no doubt for me, in my view, but there's also a task of implementing at national level and everything. So that is still a big task. And my brother, I think it was Uhuru, about institutionalizing the youth movement. I don't think it's necessary to institutionalize this movement. I can give so many examples where movements have been institutionalized and they're always infiltrated by some elements, and then it becomes very easy to dismantle them. So I feel that we have a common interest. We want democracy, we want tax justice. We can come together as young people. We don't need to institutionalize. We have tools, we have social media, we can do that. There's just a lot of potential we can achieve through that. So personally, I do not believe institutionalization because the nature of our countries, we know them, they are manipulators, they are corrupt. So I wouldn't agree with that. And then the role that about youth being trained and being knowledgeable, I agree with that. About AI, and this is something we are trying to do. As I said earlier, knowledge is very important, but to the young people, how do you do it? How do you capacitate them? How do you sensitize them? It's not through big reports and graphs and all that stuff. You have to get stuff which is entertaining to them, stuff which is easy for them to understand. So it's a new generation. It's a technology-powered generation, so we have to adapt as well. And it's something we are trying to do at YTGen. Then in terms of what we've done for the finance bill, the campaigns in the protests in Kenya, sorry, we've been at the center. I don't know whether I have time to explain, but we developed a youth manifesto in the run-up to the general elections in Kenya. I think that was in 2022. And one of the things that we put in there we were pushing for fair tax systems, fair tax policies, especially in the favor of young people. I could go in detail, but that is a policy which is a public document, and some of the partners we worked with, KYMCA, I think it is Kenya Young, members of County Assembly, they were very big players there. I think we also worked with the National Youth Council. They are rejecting the finance bill as well. We worked with them on that document, but we've also had a statement out. Of course, we do not subscribe to the violence and the killings and the lootings, but we agree with the substance why the bill should be rejected. And then how we can make young people engage more. It is about, as I said, simplifying this information, making it easier for them to understand, engaging them. I disagree with people who say that we are not interested in some of these things. We are very much interested. It's just that the times are different. Your times may not necessarily be our times. The way we comprehend things is not the same way your generations comprehend. So I think it just requires doing a shift. And on this note, we're also running a campaign, a social media campaign around the UN Tax Convention. We are planning it to be a continental campaign. We want to have young people out there. We want, first of all, sensitize them, but also want them to send messages to their governments, to the countries in the global north on why it is necessary to pass the UN Tax Convention. And we shall be sharing this information on social media so that we have as many young people from across Africa participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Allen. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you very much for your time and for your for engaging with us during this session. So the time is over. Maybe lunch break, I think. Thank you very much.